This is an audiobook presentation of Alternator, a novel by Jesse Holcomb. Published by Russell Manor Publishing. Los Angeles, California. Narration by Johnny W. Malloy. The following is a work of fiction. Names, characters, and incidents are either the products of the author's imagination or are used fictitiously. Any resemblance to real persons or things is purely coincidental. All rights reserved by the author. Part 1 of 4. Lester. Chapter 1. His bachelor uncle's assisted suicide note. Life continued as life always had before. Life was a dynamo that way. Life waiting to greet you every morning without a single lapse. With age, Lester saw the big battles they'd prepared him for were well beneath expectations, and the whole thing seemed enormously silly sometimes. These were days of prosperity, ease, low and hungry boredom, not just for him. He spoke with his friends, and they all said the same. Yes, bored. Perhaps they only played along, agreed in order to humor him. If so, he thought with a fragile smile crossing his thin lips, what fine friends to have. What terror to have so many friends. Those minds and faces so much like your own, which you see walking towards you among the faces of strangers. And closer it is not them at all, but a stranger, in fact. Or worse, it is them. And you stand and talk as people walk by, sweep silently around you, and you and your friend talk there on the street. And all the things that you share are so similar. Lester had grown up in a small town, had gone off to a distant school, and now lived in a large city. It was not an uncommon trajectory for a young man of some ambition, if one could judge by the stories in the books he'd read. Once he was there, the city pleased him in almost every way. His mind swelled with the communities, their connections, the 10,000 corners that begged a dozen chance encounters. Then, failing that, Lester also loved the soothing silence that the city grew there within his own breast. His most grievous sins were surely inconsequent in the face of these dumb automobiles, this remarkable merchandise, and everywhere living men and women who bustled about briskly, without any souls to speak of. The city was new and hectic enough to humor him for a goodly while. As it turned out, the pleasure lasted a full 2 years or so. Then things began to change in subtle ways. The shine began to dull, and Lester began to feel as if all the things that had so beguiled him were, upon closer examination, more than a little sinister. The city had always seemed sinister, he supposed, but now it actually bothered him. One evening came when Lester found a particular envelope in the mailbox at the bottom of the stairs. The envelope was made of exceptionally fine paper, addressed by a hand whose letters swooped into one another with a hasteful grace. Lester saw the name in the unstamped corner, and then stood there with all the steps yet to climb and suddenly very tired, even a bit weak, with nothing to do once he climbed those stairs but open the beautiful envelope and read the letter inside, which he did not much want to do. Once inside his apartment, Lester put the letter on the table and walked swiftly to his bed. There he stumbled into a ditch of deep after-work sleep that lasted all of 2 hours. The far edge of his unconsciousness frayed out in ideas that made half sense and were very good. crucial to the utopias that might yet sprout, if only he could roll over and open his eyes without them all tearing open. After rising, he walked into the room where the television was and picked up a large book of paintings that belonged to his roommate. The images inside were of incomparable feeling to Lester in his drowsy, mawkish state. Flemish peasants walked in fields of flattened and ungathered wheat, tended to moist-eyed cattle whose spittle-flecked chins were perfectly conveyed in 4 or 5 bips of white. He came back to the letter finally, as his mind cleared and the pictures bored him. He took it back to his room and read it all the way through without even much pausing to think upon its contents.
Bad news, Lester. By now I'm dead and perhaps cremated. Preparations have been made, and they're going to send the pile on to your grandmother. Such ways these people have to eke a living. Marvelous civilization we're having, methinks. This here disease is cruel and gratuitous, and I'm finishing off a month's worth of painkillers tomorrow night, once I get all the necessary letters written and take a last cruise around town, which hopefully the car will be up for, as it has been sitting for a while. I find myself somewhat surprised by my sense of well-being, both physical and, spiritual, now that the end impends. Sweet Lester, I leave this world without bitterness, and with, I therefore hope, a little grace. I say this world, but in my lifetime we find it a phrase worn largely idiomatic. This is the only world we all know by now. Here we toil for our names. I ain't done much and have few mortals to remember me with those boring, stilted little stories that we grant to the mediocre dead. I will fade from your mind too, Lester, you who liked me better than the rest of the family did. This is how it should be. Let me go, 'cause I'm gone. Life runs approximately thus. We see some shapes while we are here. In busy centuries, whole eras roll through our lives. The best ideas come so perfect and bright they seem beyond time. But when our age comes, they are the floor we stand on, the lights we work under. The other ideas plow to either side, earnest but stinking of human meat, history at best and art at worst. Look, I am vague but happy, Lester. I am happy to be on my way. Anyway, let's talk about you. When you visited me last summer in Atlanta, I enjoyed you to no end. That crowd you are running with now are teaching you well, as both your library of humorous mannerisms and capacity for civility, in the face of heavy drink bore witness. It made me proud to see my own blood so witty and reserved, so singularly divorced from what the mass all so proudly tout as their feelings. It pleased me to imagine you shuffling the streets of the big city, handsome and remote, only vaguely human. I've put some thought into it since then, and before dying supposed I ought put my thoughts on the matter to you directly. You are a smart kid, and I should hope you would be able to learn from my mistakes rather than your own, and failing that perhaps you will find my mistakes funny. The bachelor's path is almost certainly the least easy for the young man, as well as the one most lightly entered. There is no ceremony, and because of this more than a few of us fool ourselves into thinking that no decision has been made at all. I of course do not condone marriage except for those timid souls who think that in life they would like to be happy. And happy they are, if they put in the hours and pay the price. You can see them most everywhere, moving their grocery bags and babies around, absorbed with their tasks and, most importantly, taking it all very seriously, knowing that however artfully things might be arranged in their mortgaged little spheres, 2 missteps means Gothic scenes of the most grim desolation and estrangement, losses from which people simply do not recover. Worse, it all goes wrong for no reason but cruel chance, a basketball rolling into the middle of a boring street. This is what they tell you when you see them for an hour or two. Now, years into their mute servitude, they complain about the worry, the paralyzing fear of afflictions that never even befall them, except, as a dead gimp said, the fear itself. In return for this, the bond of a shared destiny, no matter how bland, they surrender friendship. Its vestiges remain, but friendship, real and pertinent, must be shredded and pyred before love is ever much satisfied. In time, often decades, they come to question their decision and soon throw their piles of money at any shaman who will assure them that they have not gone wrong. They want somehow to think that they have learned as much as if they'd lived instead in that other world, where people say new things and the presents have no price. Of course, Lester, we must pity them, must tell them they are right. As bachelors, confirmed bachelors, although I suspect you are only recently contemplating the oath, we alone have the comfort of knowing that we are wrong. Our life is by turns lonesome, cramped, and often inexplicable even to ourselves. The pleasures we find there, though, are honest ones and may be swallowed whole. We do not owe anyone else any part of our pleasures or even a coherent explanation of how they were obtained. Our lives are free at best, but as often merely cheap. Friends are trouble to have. The distance between you and your familiar is a hard space to navigate, but it is also the most important number in the whole relation. Misunderstandings are worst between friends, because there is not the assumption that things will be settled. Even the dearest friend is disposable. Worse yet is when we find our friend in sorrow. It is often the case we do not understand the whole of our friend's situation, not because they did not offer it, but because when they attempted to, we displayed clear signs of our boredom, and rightly so. Understanding the whole of a person is love's special project, and too much to expect of one's friends. So encumbered, hobbled, we sit beside our stricken friend, who is by now too worn to recount any but the most vague details of their long struggle. We sit and wait with them, and unless otherwise committed, we remain until they seem improved. Perhaps we hold their shoulder and brush their hair out of their eyes. Perhaps again we do not do this. So it is, the weight of our affliction. It is a miserable thing to wrestle with the intimate need of a heart not explicitly open to you. What makes them so beautiful, then? The ones closed upon their love like the latched petals of a dudded bud. When there are so many persons willing to disgorge their sorrows upon the first attentive barkeep, to spread wide their rib-cage with the ease they split their legs, why then must we seek the silent and mysterious ones? Tomorrow I will die, and so my passions with me, strange matters too numerous and conflicted, by now such a tangle that I dread visit them, but with a tourist's detachment. I am sentimental as of late. Who blames me? Who could be so stringent? You were such a pretty child, Lester, so much interested in everything in the world. But even then, your smile was troubled. Even so early you hid things, I imagine. It is surely an awful thing that sits there inside a cage, inside a cave beneath an ocean. It is a thing, too, like any of the things that's ever happened, a sunny day or a drive to the movies. Play about to the edge of your pleasure. Observe, accumulate. Your friends will disappoint you finally, and when they have all grown too fantastic or obscure or pathetic, please swear that you will throw away that life and start another. Wed a girl of the third world who will bring you things from the refrigerator. Wed a handsome dame who can throw a party and loves you only slightly. But wed, wallow, languish in your wrinkles and the beaches of foreign shores. You are a smart boy, and I have surely told you nothing here that you did not already know. But at least now it is all written down somewhere. My appointment yawns toward me. She is a strong, boring girl with a bun on her head and a veterinary practice of some influence in these parts. We sadly have nothing to talk about, though she showed me a delightful catalogue of Kevorkian oils from her black briefcase at our most recent consultation. Her calloused hand will hold my manicured mitt, and soon, so soon, will come the blindness of my senses. I shall pick a nebula to haunt. Only an employee at my deathbed, my long-suffering mother on my mind. I remain your uncle.
Well, wise uncle, dead uncle, you had me going there, but I got all confused in the middle somewheres. Lester put the letter back in its envelope and lay the envelope lengthwise atop the books on his bookshelf. The letter must have been at least a second draft, probably the product of several. Maybe his uncle had run it through his head until he knew it more or less, word for word. Lester did not compose much, but supposed the more crucial documents were finished long before paper entered the picture. He got the letter out of its envelope and read it again. He got rather misty this time and sat for a long spell on the side of his bed. Lester's roommate came home. They talked for a while, and Lester did not see fit to mention his recent loss. Lester's roommate did not note any change in Lester's demeanor, which meant either Lester was covering well, or his roommate was inattentive. Or a bit of each. the solution to most stupid questions. God, did his parents know yet? Mail pumped most quickly between the big cities, he figured, which meant they might still have a day or two of ignorance. Maybe he was the first in the whole family to know. If he kept silent now, surely he'd be called on his decision later. He wished his uncle had given him at least a bit of advice on how to handle this, the far more pressing issue. His roommate went out to drink with a few of their friends, and Lester stayed, claiming exhaustion. It was not far from true. On the fire escape, which doubled as balcony, he leaned out to where he could see a few of the skyscrapers, red lights ablink. Sky, of course, was simply what was up and not the sort of thing that you could scrape. There was the stratosphere, but it was tricky to say just where that started. So instead, we took the tallest buildings we had the money and smarts to construct, and decided that where they stopped, the sky was just starting. Lester had read an article once about how they could make even taller skyscrapers, 2 and 3 times the height of the tallest ones up now, but that there would never be room inside for all of the elevators. Algebra of some sort. He had once thought that the sole purpose of monuments was to make one feel small. Then for some time he was happy enough that they were there. Supposed maybe they represented the cooperation of the people inside, even if it were created by the compulsion of the unreachable carrot. For a moment here, though, on his landing of the rusty staircase, they seemed to be nothing but what they were. Immense dark towers that loomed many miles. Chapter 2. Leave the capital. It is accepted that the ambitious young man from the provinces who goes to the city eventually returns to those fields whose paps first surrendered suck. One almost cannot overstate the power with which the native land bewitches him. Those gullies, those groceries, those familiar faces, grown strangely old, are what he understands best in all the broad world. They are the platonic ideal of all he's encountered in the intervening years, and their unchanged essence, upon return, reminds him, in the most intimate whisper, of his own temporary nature. Lester becomes sad sometimes to be the person whom inevitably he is, privileged in his way in his wealthy country, well-fed but never fat. At times like this, Lester takes pleasure at least in this peculiar century which he was born. Split atom, exploded population, dead God, and all of that. In comfort, too, just how often he pictures them yokels of 75 to 100 years past, their spindly pipe-smoking bodies succumbing to minor infections, awaiting the spring rich with square dances and tent revivals, and, most adorably, never traveling 100 miles from where their mother dropped them. And so, never knowing what Arkansas really meant. For his own reasons, he always pictures them in Arkansas, his own native land, whose unsubtle hills forbid the penetration of a secular sanity, not to mention decent television reception. When he tells people where he is from, and does not lie, they are most always a bit taken aback. Their perception of backwardness strips bare even the grim reality. Lester's parents deliver the news late the next evening that his uncle has left him just under $200,000. Lester speaks to his mother first. She expresses the general regrets, and then reports that his father has something to tell him. For a goodly while, no one is on the phone at all, and he hears their 2 voices a mutter. His father says something along the lines of, "Well, God damn it," and then takes the reins. His father's sentiments after the initial pronouncement are thankfully rather muted. Lester got the best cut of anyone in the family, but everyone else did okay too, even the ones with whom the uncle no longer talked. This meant there'd be no resentments awaiting Lester at Christmas time. Lester's father meandered here. He realized his son was going to waste a good deal of this money. Blow it out his ass were his words, which, Lester supposed, meant lots of expensive meals out, but ultimately Mr. Lachenksky Wyatt hoped that at least his son would not waste it all. Lester's father pauses rather expressively here, then wonders briefly how exactly a person could manage to waste all that money, beginning to giggle at his boy's ludicrous windfall. Lester joins him, and soon they are laughing outright, in a gradually more and more sinister tone, until Lester's mother takes the phone again and reminds Lester that this is actually a matter of great importance. That evening, Lester goes out drinking, in a mood of sure-footed delirium, and puts many, many rounds of drinks for many people on his credit card. He misses work the next day, and that afternoon quits the job he decides he now hates. That night he goes out, buys drinks again, though this time it's fewer drinks for fewer people. It takes him a week to decide that he is leaving the city for somewhere less expensive. The week is spent happily enough in museums and restaurants, but he cannot deny the changes his uncle has wrought in his world, spookily enough from beyond the grave. Back home, Lester's extended family is trying to decide how to commemorate the passing, now that the ashes have arrived. They have promised to wait for Lester, and seem to even desire his advice. In the old French novels Lester had been fond of in college, there'd come a point when the young hero would return to the warm breast of his family from the cruelties of Parisian society. This part always went pretty much the same. His appreciation of the scenery had changed with his exposure to massive romantic landscapes in the galleries of Paris. Random smatterings of hills, trees, livestock, and peasants now arrived at his eye as fantastic arrangements complete within and unto themselves. He would sit and watch the flock move across the field, stunned with beauty and his ambition briefly mislaid. He would find himself a handsome walking stick and make his way from one overlook to another in jaunty, ridiculous-looking steps. He'd tip his hat at red-faced fellows, and they would wave and smile back. Their teeth would be terrible. He'd strike an impressive figure at the piano recitals and garden clubs which constituted provincial society, otherworldly to the locals in his beauty and calm. He'd wonder if, perhaps it would not be better to woo into matrimony this kindly pansy-faced girl, with whom he sat beneath a trellis sickening with fragrance, this only daughter of a flower merchant, whose fat dowry the country folk discussed so readily, so nakedly. Surely she'd be the better receptacle of his love than the wife of the porcelain manufacturer, or else that woman's daughter, a pale creature who offered her hand to his lips so limply, and so on. The author would ramble out some attractive and harmless prose, until finally the hero realized, in a chapter or three, that the provinces bored him frankly shitless, and he'd best get back to the capital before he threw himself beneath a picturesque swaying wagon, heaped high with hay and mud-spattered peasants. Lester, for his always obscure reasons, thought it important that if he were to leave the city, it should be forever. He wanted to be wholly disgusted and moreover bored with the city's bill of goods before taking his final leave. He bent all his thoughts to this goal and did not have a hard time of it. Without emotional or financial entanglements of consequence, our world is largely a reflection of the insubstantial clouds which pass each day over the heart. Lester, employing the milder forms of self-deception, convinces himself that this unpleasant inconsistency in his feelings is the fault of the city itself, rather than his own willful recklessness. His thoughts run that since the experiences of the city are often random and odd, they distort the experience of life in all manner of subtle, even devious ways. The thought, if he carried it much further, would likely have his beloved friends half-consciously plotting evil against him, and the bums on the street casting hexes. Lester could not even entertain what undoubtedly made the better sense, that the city was rather like an omnipresent and very confused friend next to whom one could feel very much together. From here he could perhaps have even extrapolated that in the featureless spaces of his rural homeland he would inevitably feel the foreigner for his few odd ideas which the city could easily absorb. As it stood, he packed his little things in boxes and made his goodbyes. He took an almost heroic stance in the face of leaving, said that what he did now hurt him badly, but in the end was the right thing to do, as history would surely show. His friends, for their part, understood well the need to feel one was moving forward at this age, even if the step one took appeared a flight back to the comforts of childhood. His friends expected to see him back in a few months, and they knew they could weather his absence without too many tears. With surprising speed, Lester found himself on a plane back to his hometown, or at least to Springfield, Missouri, the nearest city with a legitimate airport. He had hoped that perhaps someone would wind up accompanying him to his gate, but it was a weekday when he left, so everyone was working or otherwise occupied. Leaving was a muted feeling, and left him desiring drama of any sort. In leaving, he came to feel an exaggerated insubstantiality regarding the whole 2 years that he'd spent there in the city. When you finally go, no employee of the municipality thanks you for your loyal service to the glossy enterprise, nor does an official certificate of commendation arrive the following week at your forwarding address. The city is not a whole, but an amalgam of objects and the people who manipulate them. The city stretches her tendrils far into the country, gas stations and value shopping crammed beside one another at the sides of unpleasant divided highways. Lester was awfully happy to again see hills and agriculture, the green circles of wheeled irrigation. Chapter 3. 2020 on the Rain Song. Lester in his boyhood room again. He's used by now to returning here and spending the night every 6 months or so. The room has lost the sense of being his for the most part, and for that he is grateful. It contains a good many of the holy relics of his youth, but also something new every time he returns. This time a handsome bureau, with a top like Philip Johnson's AT&T tower. The bureau looks old and is probably expensive, too nice to be in the room, which Lester still thinks of as his own. How many times did I masturbate here? Lester wonders. It wouldn't look like much in a really big jug, he decides. He goes through boxes of old things. He has already harshly edited their contents a year or so before, but they are still rife with only slightly amusing juvenilia. There is a small rubber-banded stack of letters received from fast friends he made at a summer camp in the summer that he was 14. The declarations made therein are frightful things to behold now, ridiculously earnest sentiments made to him by people he can no longer remember. Who was I, is the thought most with Lester. Will another decade removed see him as embarrassed by his former self, his present incarnation? So saying suggests that Lester is not already embarrassed to be who he is. At the bottom of another box he finds an object of quite profound interest. He lifts it with the awe of the archaeologist at that relic which, one muses, if not given appropriate reverence, might melt the flesh off of one's cheekbones. It is the Led Zeppelin boxed set. It shows heavy use but also loving ownership, the scuffs on the cardboard box due to its being repeatedly opened and closed, rather than being injuries caused by individual occasions of carelessness. Inside he knows the gray foam awaits, and the 3 jewel boxes untouched for many years. Lester can remember the day when he bought the set, and how he rode back from a shopping mall in Memphis with the object on his lap all the way, perusing the liner notes, and even holding the discs themselves up to the light to see how much of their surface was occupied with information. The music was put to fine use that summer. Many cigarettes and sunny days were exhausted in contemplation of its wonders. So great was the pleasure the music gave him that merely holding the box in his hands now is a dreamy, pleasant thing. Simultaneously, he feels some trepidation at actually opening the box, full aware that what waits inside is an experience which he has outgrown. 2 Lesters were about to do battle here, or rather the elder Lester was about to do away with Lester Jr. once and for all. But so it must be, lest Lester should find himself one of those miserable lot, given to saving their stuffed animals and cooing at the bright colors on old postcards. Fortunately, he was pulled away from the task before his thought became action. He was called by his father to discuss a few financial issues regarding the inheritance, and was so made to rifle through stacks of papers while wearing a serious expression. Lester's father had a way of seeming especially ludicrous when he was most attempting to convey authority. a quality that made such times as now particularly difficult. If Lester in the least betrayed an irreverent thought, the old man would take it as an affront to his person, and would proceed to harangue his son in a manner alternately frightening and pathetic. And so Lester spent a stressful hour in the den full of framed certificates and the cobwebby heads of dead deer. Upon return to his room, the Led Zeppelin boxed set, lying on the bed, was an object of idle curiosity, wiped clean of all those sinister overtones which he'd sensed from it but an hour before. He opens it now without hesitation. Oh, wonders! The songs themselves were gigantic things, part of the radio and jukebox fabric which constitutes a shared knowledge between most Americans of a certain age bracket. Scanning down the playlist, he realized that he had a second sort of knowledge, a knowledge shared only by persons specially acquainted with the boxed set, the order in which the songs appeared in this collection. There was much in this as well, the manner in which the mood of a certain song anticipates and colors the experience of that which comes after. Of almost equal importance, he supposed, was the length of the silence between songs, which must carefully match the rhythm of the two compositions it bridges so as not to jar the listener's sensibilities. There were persons whose whole careers were devoted to the successful execution of such minutiae, Lester felt reasonably certain. Fine civilization, this one. After some deliberation, he decided on a song to listen to. It was the Rain Song, the last song on the second CD, right after the AOR mainstay Stairway to Heaven, which contained the bit of ignoble sophistry, "There are two paths you can go by. But in the long run, there's still time to change the road you're on," which back in the day Lester had believed to be quite a clever refutation of something or other. The Rain Song, though, at almost 8 uninterrupted minutes, is a lesser-known jewel, a thing unto itself. Lester makes the choice for unrepentantly sentimental reasons. The Rain Song is the soundtrack to a fondly remembered time in Lester's own little life. The summer after his first year of college, Lester came home to Arkansas. The spring semester had been extremely difficult for Lester, replete with academic and social failures. When he arrived back home, he arrived as one thrown by a lucky wave upon the shore of those who could look after him. He was listless, confused, and primarily very, very lazy. Spells such as these are good to suffer, so that we may see that even in sheer incapacity, souls will rise up around us to attend to our most miserable necessities. One of these merciful angels that summer was his mother, who fed him well, and placed handsome fans of new slacks and shirts upon his bed while he was out otherwise occupied. The other was Pete Convert, Lester's only friend from high school, who was also home that summer, and in whose company many happy days were spent. It was hard to say just what it was about that summer which so satisfied. Nothing much at inspection. All Pete seemed to do was get intoxicated in various ways, and that was more or less all that they did during that summer. Pete lived in a trailer out in the woods in the big hills to the south. The scenery there was beautiful and wild, frightening when a strong storm would roll in. Pete was almost incapable of conversation or concentrating on anything for very long, doubtless a side effect of his lifestyle. Pete also had an unpleasant older brother named Tim, who wore mascara on occasion and always made a point of beating up Pete whenever Lester would come over, sometimes holding his little brother in a headlock or half Nelson for 5 minutes or so, long past the point where it would be funny. After such a scene, Pete's explanation to Lester would be that his brother was an all-right guy, just very excitable. After some time, they found that the easiest means by which they could avoid Tim was for Lester to call ahead, so Pete could wait for him out in the front yard. What they did then varied. Sometimes they would go wandering on grown-over roads and woods that grew ever denser, darker. Pete would take Lester on a tour of the local trash dumps, dead automobiles and an enormous pile of identical gin bottles, the life's work of some hillbilly long dead. Lester would have been embarrassed for someone to see the two of them, two skinny young men combing through a pile of trash out in the woods, but the concern always left him, for the experience itself was such a pleasant one. They would often go on hotter days to a small, secluded beach, about a 10 minutes drive from Pete's trailer, where they'd swim, drink, smoke pot, and listen to music on Lester's boombox. There was a tall bluff across the river, and if you set the box at the right distance from it, the music would echo back at you pleasingly. The song which particularly enthralled Lester that summer, that he would listen to once and then hit the button to listen to again, was the Rain Song. He has particular memories of even enthusiastically pointing out tempo and chord changes to Pete, not that Pete was ever paying much attention. Lester plays the song finely. He feels immediately uneasy, but giddily so. The song for its intentions is skilled, flawless. One does not feel in the presence of performance but of product. This is not take 2 or 3, but simply the Rain Song, as it is and shall forever be. It stinks of money, of the best technology of its time, limitless indulgence for the least significant of its tracks. This is the part of Led Zeppelin's image which Lester has never quite resolved for himself. The well-heeled bohemian life, curved driveway lined with triumphs, long-haired toddlers of both sexes, sitar in the attic. With whom did they comfortably socialize? For the size of the investment, the song proves to Lester's ear an undistinguished battle, albeit one quite shamelessly heartfelt. The start is sweet, the middle becomes a bit confused and angry with itself, and at the end, there's a big sunny field where cartoon deer graze beneath 2 tall, gnarled oaks. The trip the listener takes is the rich kid's opus, a long, crazy night whose recollection is dotted with haze, and at the end of which Daddy bails you out and drives you back to Mom. Chapter 4. Soap on a Rope. For a week or so, Lester became reacquainted with his hometown and the surrounding countryside. His new compulsion, into which he entered most eagerly, was to be struck by a pretty scene from the road and ease his car almost immediately off into the grass, scale the barbed wire fence, if there was one, and then run right into the middle of that beauty. He would go sit at whatever scenic spot presented itself and wait until the animals began their rustling again. Sometimes he would stay in one spot for as long as an hour, hoping that with sufficient contemplation, a part of him might always remember this place, this happy meeting of tree, rock, and flora, wedged happenstance between undignified cowfields. It was places like this that pleased him best, that had merely happened in the process of clearing, too steep or too lovely to be put to good use by the owner. Nature in its other remaining forms was less pure than this was, navigated by trails which designated the means by which you should experience it, or packaged in slabs designated by exterior authority, where the beauty fell upon one in dense, monotonous waves. A wood surrounded on every side by fields, though, was a wood that fought for its own existence in the fair marketplace, that suffered for its ideals. There is a process of decompression that comes after the scenery stops shocking Lester, where the constant primping and posing of the city gives way to the slackness of appearance which the country requires. In assuming this posture, he was not altogether successful. The lesson of meticulous grooming by now, too, hardened in his spirit. All around him the unlovely sprouted, people walking about with shirts wrinkled by the rectangle of cardboard the garment had just been wrapped around, or faces sprouting uneven growths of whisker for no purpose but to avoid shaving. And of course, there were all manner of explosions in the bodily form, fantastical asses and bellies defying perhaps not so much the conventions of society as the laws of physics. The sheer number of both subtly and manifestly unsightly people made the rare figure of some bearing not only conspicuous, but otherworldly, immense. Lester still remembered a man he'd recently seen at the grocery store with a slender beauty on his arm, the girl of an age that she might have easily been the fellow's wife or daughter. Though dressed in overalls and cheap tennis shoes with Velcro straps, the man still projected austerity and grace. His long beard had gone gray and curly at the sides, and his eyes were deep with the contemplation of mysteries Lester had never been privy to. Perhaps, Lester hoped, this was a place where, in pockets, legitimate mystery was still possible. He wasn't thinking of those calculated systems of belief thrown up as a wall between oneself and an all-too-visible reality. Denizens of college towns mumbling of the town council's complicity in all manner of impractical imbroglio against their cooperative grocery. No, what Lester sensed were whole new manners in which to think and behave beyond those normally proscribed. The perceptions of a soul tuned to the turning of the seasons and the drain pattern of hill and valley could not help but be nearer perfection than the perceptions of someone who gave even the least rational consideration to the glamorous lives of the cinema stars. The problem here was that though this was unquestionably the truth, Lester's mind had for so long been trained about the superficial that were he to sit down among the fellows at the feed store, the pleasure he would take there would be at best one of novelty in their topics of conversation. He simply did not share their vocabulary and interests. Theirs a whole world composed of necessities different than his own. Truer yet was that though they might be pleased enough to have him listen mutely and perhaps learn something, he would be too embarrassed to ever actually do so, wherever this thought was going to. At the moment, Lester was seated on a padded recliner in his parents' backyard drinking beer and watching the bees go round a trellis of succulent southern blooms he wasn't sure the name of. He realized at this moment that he was perhaps getting too old to be wasting his hours on such trifles as invisible realities or whatever he'd just been thinking about, with his eyes closed and the bottle almost falling from his grasp. A long, long vacation, this might yet prove to be, months and years in its perfection. He needed to leave his parents' house pretty soon. They couldn't help but feed him, and it couldn't be too encouraging for them to come home to their sole progeny asleep on the big slippery sofa after they'd been out working all day. They were decent enough parents that they would not compare their own youth to Lester's, so Lester instead wound up thinking about it a lot, all on his own. At the age that Lester was now, Lester's father was already carrying Lester about in his arms, smiling in old photographs taken at scenic overlooks beside various highways in the locality. Lester's father at 24 was a man, where Lester is still very much a boy, unsettled and curious. Lester half comforts himself supposing that his parents wish their adolescence could have lasted as long as his has, and perhaps they take comfort at having served their boy so well. We remember the past differently than it was. Our most passionate moments, if provided for us as film sequences with artistic camera angles and professional actors, would be too predictable or poorly paced to watch more than once or twice. Happily, these things do not exist, and so we can still imagine ourselves standing at given junctures in the stream, rather than realizing that we were directed about by unbending circumstance and the words of our betters into that which was merely practical. We do here and there get glimpses that things may not have been as our recollection romantically insists they were. Lester himself had moments of this a couple of weeks ago, looking through his letters and diaries from high school, wherein he discovered many sentiments which he associates with an older, wiser Lester, even a Lester who has only come into being since graduating from college. Of particular worry to him was an essay he wrote for an English class upon the subject of ambition. The 10th grade Lester had had the good sense to say that ambition was almost always a detriment to happiness, either by not reaching one's goals, and so feeling the cold teeth of failure, or by succeeding and having to live with the rewards of one's accomplishment, which would always be more meager and complicated than you'd imagined. These things were all said quite gracefully, and there was a large, corny A circled at the top of the paper. For Lester, the quandary presented by this piece of paper was that he imagined himself in those days to be a rather bright-eyed kid who put far too much stock in what the world would have to offer him. It seemed to Lester, thinking back on the grand curve of his lifetime of thoughts, that only recently had he come to any sort of adult understanding of how to make a life for oneself pleasant enough to actually go about living it. But then here he was, tiny teenaged Lester, saying the very same things that today's Lester thought that he had long and passionately struggled to discover. The decision Lester came to finally on the matter, after half an hour of languorous bewilderment and many times rereading the 4 handwritten paragraphs, was there were different levels in knowledge, and that the one represented in this essay was the most superficial, a recitation of a truth readily enough apparent, though not yet experienced on a personal level. This explanation was certainly more palatable than the alternative one, that in the intervening years he had really grown no wiser, only forgetful. Between these two merging streams, or rather with the tributary of the second feeding the boulder path of the first, and both of them pushed by the high drain-off of Lester's sleepiness, comes a funny picture. Well enough, he will see it now at the edge of his afternoon dreams, as he sets the bottle down in the grass and folds his hands over his belly, in eager anticipation of unconsciousness. The memory comes, and then the sleep, and magically hereafter, he will recall none of it. Lester remembers being 4 years old, and on Father's Day for the very first time being allowed to pick the present himself. His mother had taken him to the drugstore on the square, supposing he might select some cologne or a fancy shaving set. But Lester had become almost immediately enchanted with a large block of green, fragrant soap cast about the ends of a length of white nylon rope. Lester thinks there was something at the time also called Pope on a rope, which was the same but pontifical in shape and white in color. And either way, aren't those 3 evocative words to all rhyme with each other anyway, conjuring all manner notions, cleanliness, celibacy, suicide. Either way, his mother had made it a special point to his father that Lester had picked out this present himself, but even so, his father couldn't help laughing when the thing itself was unwrapped. Lester's mother had started in laughing too, and Lester had started crying as much from confusion as hurt, so his father had grabbed the present, denuded it of its display box and run for the back door, while clumsily pulling off all of his clothes. In the backyard naked, this was when they still lived in the country, he was sprayed by his wife and then his son from the cold garden hose, and he made himself frothy with the help of his marvelous gift. The spectacle was enough to make them all laugh enough that the previous unpleasantness was obliterated many times over. What Lester sees, though, before his thoughts are gone, is not a man haggard with responsibility, but a fellow yet 3 years Lester's senior, having a good deal more fun than Lester ever has himself. The man is boyish to look at, beads hanging from his well-groomed beard, and his goose-pimpled body mostly hairless, his shrunken member goofily swinging and blades of cut grass stuck to the soles of his high-kicking feet. Chapter 6. Big Window. The next day Lester suggested to his parents over dinner that perhaps he should rent a place in the area, and the day after that his father called with a hot lead. He gave Lester a realtor's number, and Lester made an appointment for later that afternoon. When Lester met up with the realtor, he realized he recognized her slightly, and felt some embarrassment at having to ask her name. She, for her part, asked after his parents, and seemed to take pleasure in showing she knew quite a lot about his family. He had enough experience with middle-aged persons to know that few among them had any sympathy for the thoughtlessness of youngsters, and he supposed this might be one of the things that caused them to grow ever ludicrously older. The house was 3 miles or so from town. When standing in the right place, you could see the silhouette of the city water tower in the distance, like some huge precarious mushroom. The lawn was unmowed, and inside of the house all the furniture was covered up with white sheets, something Lester had not seen before in real life. The house was young, early 80s he guessed, and the rooms were huge and had interesting shapes. The pictures on the walls were ugly things, expensively framed amateur photographs of cobblestone Dutch streets where various miserable little festivals were underway. The realtor added that the furniture would be there for Lester's use, and after peeking under a few of the sheets, Lester decided this would be okay. The woman, whatever her name was, knew her job well, finally guiding Lester to the house's loveliest feature, a terraced patio where an algae-clogged concrete fountain stood over a somewhat excessive amount of wrought iron furniture. The patio looked out on a huge, empty field, with at least a dozen tall, evenly spaced poplars in a gently receding line at its far end, their stretch shimmering slightly and leaning this way and that. Lester took the house. The rent seemed not unreasonable, though it was more than he had ever spent on a dwelling before. Of course, he'd never had his own field before, a prospect he felt absolutely giddy at. It made him want to rent a couple of picturesque horses with flowing manes as well, or at least an old mule on a long rope. The realtor gave him the keys once he'd signed the lease, 6 months, and the option for another 6, after which she said the old doctor and his wife, who owned the place, would finally be coming back from Europe. "We should all have their life," she added. And to this, Lester made a smile. He was pretty sure it came off badly. He waved to her from the front door, watched the taillights of her small domestic automobile strobe between the trunks of his long, tree-lined driveway. His parents were a bit surprised at the apparent opulence of his new digs. Both the square footage and acreage were numbers his mother gently asked him to repeat. He got off the phone with them as soon as he could and went for a jaunt to all the corners of his field, startled time and again by bolting rabbits and flushed quail, but pleased with them just as he was with everything else around him. Tomorrow, he supposed, meant shopping for provisions, and eventually, soon perhaps, the pursuit of a few of his old social contacts. For the time being, though, there was the intoxication of property, this rolling field, which it took him 2 full minutes by his watch to walk across diagonally. He caught a burger in a bag on his drive through town and took it back to the house, ate it on the bed in the master bedroom. He discovered a very big television in the wardrobe there, and watched a program devoted to frogs and the remarkable forms they assumed on various continents all about the globe. After this adventure, he went out in the field again, right to the middle, and lay down there for half an hour. There were stringy clouds moving across the crescent moon at remarkably quick speeds, which stirred in him all the standard questions. Next, in his tiredness, he did something rather unforgivable. He went to sleep in the master bedroom without changing the sheets which were already on the bed, even though the realtor had shown him the well-stocked linen closet in the hallway next to the kitchen. Lying there in the dark, he felt he could vaguely smell the old people whose bed this was. Their spoor had grown stale and complicated beneath the polyester comforter. He woke far into the night. He'd had a dream of an alarm clock going off in one of the other rooms, one of the rooms he hadn't been in yet. There was an electrical sound somewhere in the house, a hum that lasted a few minutes and died away. He wanted to get up, but the prospect of navigating unfamiliar rooms in darkness stopped him. But boredom finally made necessity of it. He went lumbering about through the murk with his arms stretched in front of him. He was mostly searching for light switches, but could not find them in any of the places he expected. The first switch he found was in the living room. Instead of lighting the interior, it lit the outdoors. He'd found the switch for a series of floodlights which illuminated the woods, which the room jutted out into. One wall of the living room was more or less all window, 6 huge panes in different shapes, and with these lights on he could see a long way out into uninterrupted wilderness. When he switched the light off again, he could only see the shapes of tree trunks against the blue of the night. He had a hard time imagining anything in all the wide world more tacky than this switch at his fingertips. He switched it on again and went to sit closer to the window. These huge windows were an innovation in middle-class housing of the last 30 years or so, byproduct of the fetishization of the untamed world brought on, Lester dreamily continued, by the much ballyhooed impending worldwide ecological catastrophe. And so, the outdoor world in all its ferociousness and feces-mottled beauty had to become a section of the house unto itself, so that by at least giving an audience to nature, you could feel better about destroying it with the byproducts of your air conditioning. In the future, these expensive additions would be charming aspects of old homes, no longer appreciated by the same systems of belief, rather like the big turrets one finds on old farmhouses, most of which never actually served as strategic places to shoot intruders from. It was strange what exaggerated importance the lights gave the small chunk of well-maintained wood, how their very existence gave the impression that something was about to happen out there. The lights weren't even all simply white, garishly enough. There were hints along the edges of the lighted patch of blue and green, weird underwatery effects. He'd have to go out the next day and see what the outlay was, perhaps even goof with the angles of the beams. Right now, though, he was content to stare into the woods and think mostly about the line where the darkness started, and where it seemed to him as if there were always some awful specter about to make itself seen, a man brandishing an antique Japanese sword and wearing nothing but a pair of blood-splattered long johns. Lester figured the effect would be all the more terrifying in this super-insulated house, where all was silent, the madman outside pointing and shouting things at you inside the window, mute there until he smashed the glass wide open. Chapter 6. Provincial Video Store. On waking, Lester discovered that in direct sunlight the color of the house's interior walls was an absolutely intolerable yellow, physically sickening to him as he moved from room to room. Driving in his car, he wondered at the oddness of this for a while, and considered what he might possibly do to remedy it. He decided he would have to draw the substantial senior citizen-style blinds and live in darkness, rather than expose himself to this color anymore. This also satisfied the reclusive weirdo impulse that was burning pretty hot in him lately. What do people do? With their time, I mean. A surprising number of them don't really socialize as such and spend lots of time with their ear to the television's rhythms, thinking they'll be the first to be informed in the case of any real emergency. No one ever means to wind up like this, but at the end of the workday, it's often all one is left. Lester visited a married friend a few months back, who lived in a gated apartment complex with an empty gym and a pool beside which one dark-haired girl was reading a paperback. A lot of perfectly good land had lately been taken up with places like this, sprawling, ugly, and identical really to any other big gated apartment complex. Lester would have said the people inside were pretty much identical too, except, see, he liked his friend. The day after arriving is typically the day for having fun, and bless their hearts, they did try. For this reason or that, they wound up in the suburban shopping district, cinderblock buildings with fronts of more expensive brick, where inside they found white warehouse ceilings, industrial carpeting, and foreign-made merchandise in wretched plenitude. By the end of 3 hours they had been inside several of these places, stores that sold widescreen televisions or huge terracotta urns or fleecy pullovers at deep discount prices. By the end of it all, his married friend looked over and commented that Lester looked very tired. Not to say that this is how people actually live, but Lester fears it is at least twice as common as he can bear to imagine. They go off to jobs where they do not actually do much of anything, and comment how nice one another's shirts look, ask one another where they got them. It happens, he knows, day after day. Over this stupid civilization is a whole other world that the dejected lumps aspire to, that in their moments of teetering recognition rushes in and arranges their illusions back into some Euclidean order. This world is their cloud of dreams, lurid and reoccurring, and they keep all these dreams in a low-ceilinged contraption called the video store. Lester, it should be understood, really liked video stores. He enjoyed film, as did most people of his generation, in an ardent and unquestioning way. It was a generation where not only had the experience of unreal things beat out the experience of real things 1,000-fold, leaving only a noxious pulp, but it was the generation where this was such an obvious truth that no one really bothered to mention it anymore. If one were to live, it would be unwise to carry out the production on that dry plain outside the front door, where one's charisma and organizational skills inevitably came under harsh scrutiny. The hours eased right by with a big block of nonsense, though. In the provinces, even the quality of one's imaginary life was diminished by the distance from any center of power. The city is the site of such dense proliferation that almost any taste can feel itself exclusively catered to. Many happy nights were acquired there by Lester for $5 or less. 6 straight indulgent hours of stunning women and Weasley men, smoking cigarettes and speaking foreign languages in tastefully decorated rooms. This was what was missing in Lester's world, just as what was missing in the world of sitcom adherents was what Lester had once felt now and again that he had entirely too much of: clever banter exchanged by good-looking comrades. At the video store in his hometown, he could only wonder at what vague itchings the faces and bodies on the boxes might be out to satisfy. Automobiles, white trash Florida beach scenes, warfare both in the overseas and urban milieu. These boxes had passed through many hands, had been peddled by the crateful off of the tailgates of pickup trucks, and during Sunbelt weekends in leaky-roofed convention centers. They had struggled through years of privation to sit here before him, to make their case in a single sentence of poor copy. They've got one summer to finally make it all happen. She sacrificed everything for her children, and then they took them away. What waited inside were tired things, the products of Johnny Paycheck. The first hour unfolded as effortlessly as the man in the suit in the airport bathroom runs his wet fingertips through his hair. This motion picture was far from fiction, as it turned out. It was an exploration of human lives and the movement of large sums of money. It was a tendril into reality, that big, hilarious reality that no one really has a decent hold on. But for some eerie reason, all these skilled and semi-skilled souls came to the same acre and told the story of these boys and girls in the hot tub, this camo-painted weightlifter hip-deep in Southeast Asia. And then they went away, lived out their own, less ferocious worlds, and even before they died, they'd forgotten it had ever happened. The movies remain, the copies too numerous to accurately tally, much less suppress. They show their age. At best, 1 in 20 is a story told because someone wanted to tell it. Ambivalent, clever, haunted and lost is Lester Lakensky Wyatt. Here in the county's largest video store, the entertainment epicenter of 1,000 square miles, he manages to mope. Someone told him something funny once, but he doesn't remember who. It enters his mind now like something discovered, faded, written in capitals on the back of a receipt in the breast pocket of a second-hand coat. If only I enjoyed watching football. Chapter 7. Giggles of the Damned. Let's let Lester talk. Pete? Shit, I'll get him. That was Tim. They sound alike. Hello? Pete? Yes? It's Lester? Lester, really? Wow, wait. The phone at Pete's trailer has a very long, very old cord, where the brown plastic's gone white at the rings with stretching. Pete walks out the front door and latches the screen, steps down from the cinder block that serves as the front step, sits down in a very rickety metal folding chair, overlooking the small valley. I just figured I'd try the old number, Lester explains. I still remembered it. Are you at the same place? Yeah, still out at the trailer. With Tim still? Yeah, it's okay. You working? No, nope. Me neither. Good so far. This is how they talk. Lester is under the mistaken impression again and again in the conversation that Pete has taken with some task more involving than talking to him. The pauses yawn weird and wide. Apparently Pete's sole project these last 4 years or so has been continuing to live in the trailer with his horrible older brother. Lester doesn't know quite how to answer up to this remarkable fact, gleaned with a half-dozen tactful queries, and followed by awful silence on the wire. The fact is that he wants to rail against his old and almost forgotten friend, to drive some shame into him by the power of sheer unpleasantness. He wants to do this, but at the same time realizes the pointlessness of doing so, the depravity of attacking someone who is badly off, even if by the product of his own laziness. Or whatever. The thing was incomprehensible to Lester. Lester got off a few good licks in the course of it. Pete was a game enough audience by laughing at subtle things in a pure, happy tone. Lester asked Pete how his romantic life was, to which Pete answered there was a married woman a mile or so to the west, and last week he watched her mow her lawn from behind some bushes. Pete relates this story less as a humorous anecdote on the sad shape of his own life, and more as something significant which has recently happened to him. After a long silence, Pete sleepily, perhaps wearily, tosses the ball back into Lester's court. Most of my emotional entanglements thus far, Lester counters, have only been marked by temporary exchange of jackets. Pete laughs at this pretty pleasantly, and Lester flatters himself with the notion that he can sum up whole years of his experience with a single perfect detail. One could also say it's funny that Lester is so flip about the subject, though this possibility honestly does not even occur to Lester. Lester suggests that perhaps they could visit sometime and talk over old times. He talks about the process of reminiscence and muses vaguely, pretentiously, on why nostalgia might be such a pleasant thing. Something terrible happens at this point, something which bothers Lester even the next morning as he lies immobile in bed. He realizes that Pete is momentarily failing to indulge him with connection, with even the least sense of familiarity. Even the best scenario is a rather grim one, that being that Pete is simply unable to understand many of the things that Lester is saying to him. It wrenches on this way for a minute or so, Lester apologizing in a long, strange soliloquy about the sort of person he is now, how he sometimes tries too hard. Pete, for his part, is merciful and mentions there's going to be a party the weekend after next, out at the trailer, and perhaps Lester would like to come to it. It will mostly be Tim's friends and various hangers-on. The party might not actually be very much fun, Pete warns, but certainly there could be some weird things to watch happening. Keg, too. The phone conversation finished, Lester realizes that it probably could not have gone very much differently. It is a difficult thing to gauge the position of another person at any given time. Maybe more like an impossible thing, considering what a mystery most of us are even to ourselves. When things happen in the world, it is almost always because they must, and not but fantastically rarely, because we individually will them to be. This is what power is, books tell Lester, and probably the definition itself, the ability to impel others to do that which they otherwise would not. Power in its most familiar digs is simply the 5-day work week and all attendant stupidity. Lester knows that he is not a powerful person. He's so good at accepting his lot that he rarely ever bothers rebelling. Pete Convert and his family, though, are a fairly powerful lot. It hunches at the edge of Lester's awareness that never having worked, no matter how squalid the consequences to one's body and mind, is a far more impressive figure to cut than making hefty monthly payments on a beautiful automobile. Then this thought apparently passes through the necessary checkpoints and sits down in the middle of Lester's head, claws scratching on the marble floor. Well, Pete is the weakest of the converts, though. It is probably a very difficult thing to be. Tim, as Lester remembers him, is simply a monster, sharply perceptive, but without the sort of sympathies which human beings generally expect of one another. Plenty of examples, of course. Lester had long ago figured Tim would be in jail by this date, but this is apparently still not the case. Either Tim has mellowed into his place in the world, a prospect which Lester finds fairly laughable, or else he has come into a new maturity regarding his interests and the manner in which they can be prudently extinguished. Tim is a smart guy, and this last one is undoubtedly the case. To realize this makes Lester feel so badly for poor Pete that he goes to the sofa and for some time wraps a large throw pillow around his head. Lester lies on the sofa breathing slightly quick and holding the pillow with both hands across his chest. His time spent alone at the house has been marked by many such exaggerated gestures as these. They come and go with his thoughts, as if he were making strong physical impressions of his passing moods, so that his mind would be more able to categorize and record them. He wasn't bothered by the whole process much, supposed that it was mild aerobic exercise, but his fear was that someone might be watching him move from window to window, as he had in his time watched others, and how bizarre his actions must appear to them. Pete's father, though, he was the root of it all. He used to live with Pete and Tim at the trailer back a very long time ago, back when Pete and Lester were still in high school together. Most everything which Lester remembers of the man is the content of one evening, which Lester spent most uncomfortably in his presence during the first semester of his high school senior year. Tim was elsewhere, and the whole evening Pete and Lester spent more or less actively avoiding Pete's father, whose room was at the opposite end of the trailer from the one that his two sons shared. Around 11 or so, they had thought it time for Lester to make his getaway. None of this was made explicit, or else Lester might have just scrambled out of the bedroom window, and the whole of the succeeding 2 hours could have been avoided. As it stood, the eldest convert was lying in wait in the combination living room and kitchen for his youngest boy and his friend, and at first sight of them stood in position to shake Lester's hand, meet his eye, and by that point there was really no getting out of the fellow's power. What followed next came down to a lecture. Lester remembers little of the precise content, except that we were the tools of them, a ridiculous few, spectral pale, and with the means to indulge their increasingly complicated tastes in the medium of our flesh. Weird things Lester's done well to mostly forget. Everything that Lester had ever been told was worth a shit was actually wrong, wicked, coerced emasculation to serve their goals. Systems of indoctrination. Almost as old as people, their primary mechanisms passionately described as the old man hit the palm of one hand with the fist of the other, drew things in the air with his forefinger. Transfixing, actually. This was the first inkling of any such unusual thoughts existing in Lester's recollection. Lately, though, similar ideas seemed to be the currency of the bemused almost everywhere he went, marked especially by a blunt cynicism regarding any possibility of reform. In almost any adult conversation, it seemed someone would refer vaguely to the way things really work, a phrase to which everyone would assent immediately, wordlessly, as if they were all thinking about almost exactly the same thing, but knew it best to not get too far into it. While such ideas were good fodder for chat at parties, it was clear on that awful evening that to Pete's father, they represented something of a reality, the world in which he quite impractically chose to live his life. Telling, too, was that Pete failed to apologize for his father, as children tend to do when their friends are exposed to the more peculiar portions of their parents. Instead, Pete had told Lester to have a safe drive home, then touched him lightly upon the shoulder, and flashed a half-smile which badly bothered Lester for several days thereafter. "Pete!" Lester cries out on the sofa. Most tragic of all the friends Lester's ever had, no fucking contest. Pete had never been the brightest bulb, and Lester can only wonder how such awful, half-baked nonsense has shaped and diluted his understanding. Though Pete perhaps had a fair inkling that his father was full of shit about most things, the stupid homebrew theories had entered him less as fluffy opinions and more like the names which we give to colors. In short, the boy was surely ruined. Lester goes for a walk in the field. It is late afternoon, and far off he can hear a small motorcycle incessantly moving, quiet for a while and then going again, further off. The sad part is, this is all there is for anyone, no matter whose boss or boss's boss they are. A sunny day, a place with all the things and people that inhabit it, wanting one thing and getting another. Loneliness. Lester has been ready for some time for the unremarkable stranger to recognize him on the street and say, "Here's the half we've kept hidden." And then for the whole world to be ever so exciting all over again, even for just a little while. It's probably time to let go of that. This is the real world, uncomfortable notion, like an ambulance stuck in a traffic jam. It saddens Lester how far he is from Pete now, how much their differing experience must necessarily make strangers of two who were once comfortably close to each other. It is a foregone conclusion, though, isn't it? And this miserable party he will soon attend surely the irrefutable proof. A function is served by it, of course, that the ambitious in the provinces are corrupted by the easy pleasures of the capital, and in their culture and refinement become of no use to the very people from which they sprang. There was probably no hand pulling at that handle, though, and even if there were, it was Lester's. Chapter 8. 4 scenes from a slow weekend. That Friday evening, Lester feels fairly positive about himself and the whole world around him. As gloom and disaster fade, Lester begins to think of himself embarked on some project regarding life and its proper usage. It is all very hazy to him now, but he can see structures hauling themselves up out of the silence. He thinks even some misty Eastern thoughts, all of the world's unpleasant trials leading toward an attainable perfection. When he closes his eyes, he imagines the East as it might be portrayed in an airline commercial. Peasants using plows and lines of red-robed monks winding their way up steep, verdant hillsides. When he wakes the next morning, he feels unwell again. Even the unemployed observe the weekend. Patterns of traffic scatter, and the theaters pack with freshly scrubbed youngsters. The coming of the weekend marks the end of unemployment's primary perk, the ability to stroll unmolested through majestically depopulated infrastructure. Amenities which appear miserably cramped to the working population are palaces of luxury to the unemployed. Timed just right, one can have an entire grocery at their private disposal. The unemployed live in a realm of ancient resonance, reminding them of the glorious old world where meeting the face of your fellow was a blessedly rare event. The weekend floods the land with the sticky faces of the mass, looses them across the parking lots like battlefield reenactments. Lester avoids the crowds these last few weekends, his general worthlessness unable to face their hard-fought bustle. On the weekend, he contents himself with activities that present themselves solely because he is alive. He cooks out of cookbooks, goes for walks through the woods, reads copiously and variously. He watches television, takes longer and longer naps. Life accumulates. Come Saturday, Lester finds himself in inordinately low spirits. It lifts Sunday afternoon as promptly as it came. No apparent trigger, but he knows that he must leave the house and plunge into the woods, find something there which will please him. He soon does, for such things are always just a matter of looking. We keep no record of the moods we move through in the course of a weekend. Such things are too small, too random to make much of, and yet they are the better half of what we experience, as interesting as the arrangement of trees in a forest. Lester lives in a dry county, which means a half-hour drive to buy a bottle of wine in a neighboring county where such things are allowed, and then another half-hour to drive the stuff back home. This Saturday he is happy for the diversion, perfectly pleased to roll through unpopulated patches and a succession of half-collapsed roadside towns. Lester speculates the appeal of ruins is their essential wrongness, the inability of even plotting capital investment to reasonably predict what shape the future will assume. Each rotten building is the project of someone's life, some soul whose careful understanding was, in time, laughable. A rural life requires immense amounts of driving, so that the driving must become an entertainment unto itself. Even in the recent past, there was still the concept of the journey, which was an exciting thing because it meant tremendous effort, and often putting one's life at real risk. In the present day, all that remains are the spaces between the cities and the time it takes to cross them, which in life's program amounts to little more than dead air. This is scenic territory, at least, flecked with overlooks and plenty of curves very pleasant to take a tad too quickly. Barns, shacks, and bridges present themselves just wherever they are needed, as natural in their way as the fields of flowers or anything else that meets his eye. Driving, if done properly, is a meditative thing, the quickly compressed scenery pushing one into the sort of realizations that only last so long as the car is moving. Then the liquor store, just over the county line, and frequented almost exclusively by citizens of the dry county. It is a strange process, yet so familiar by now that no one complains. Lester thinks liquor stores are one of adulthood's best rewards, always exceptionally clean and brimming with smiling customer service. The ridiculous proliferation of product lines serves well to disguise the bluntness of alcohol's function. The barred windows invent a sense of heady wealth, luxury. All of which overwhelms Lester a bit on this visit, such that he does not just make a purchase, but actually stocks up, fills his red plastic basket with various colors of wine and a couple of fifths of mid-range hard stuff. Money spent on booze is rarely money wasted, and Lester is hell-bent to spend his money somehow. Back at home, the bottles find themselves arrayed on the kitchen counter, lined up from the shortest to the tallest. Later on this Saturday finds him in the master bedroom drinking pink wine and watching a Civil War documentary on the satellite television. The program is one in a series of hour-long episodes, each of which concerns itself with one of the battles which made up the war. This evening's presentation is Appomattox. What Lester draws from the program is that war is in many ways like baseball, a struggle which is at least 90% mental. There are slow shots moving in and away from the noble faces of generals in old daguerreotypes as their journals and letters are read. They complain again and again of mental maladies, the inability to go forward, the inability to make sense of the duties which rest so miserably upon their shoulders. One gets the impression of a war fought not by men with a taste for blood, but by shop clerks, suddenly thrust with the duty of sending boys out to fall for uncertain goals. It is sad, the human psyche buckling beneath political necessities of fantastic, fateful scope. They mention Jesus anxiously, repetitively. The narrator is quite terrible, playing up the human side of red arrows topping crests and emerging from dense forest by putting an overplayed hem and haw into his voice, eerily overconfident of his persuasive powers. Despite this and other kinks in the production, Lester is in a soppy mood and takes the content portrayed directly into his heart. The Wyatt family line is dotted with Civil War dead, and if their ghosts walk, how saddened they must be to observe his timid maneuvers, and too the terrible condition of the South to this very day. Wars are little but the interests of gold made flesh, as well as a surefire cure for boredom. These ghosts, after dragging their guts along for almost a century and a half now, must be even more cynical than Lester is. Lester drinks more than he intended. Not that he went into the project with his terms too strictly defined. But certainly he did not mean to drink to the point of stumblebum nausea, uneasy enough to be found rushing to the bathroom at one point. The mirror over the vanity caught his attention when he realized the toilet would not be needed. He watched his face for a long time, watched the way his expression did not respond very well to the commands of his mind. Most any activity is enjoyable while drunk. Lying down on the carpet or leaning one's shoulder against the wall are subtleties that the sober person all but ignores. In drunkenness, there are things lost, but they are not missed, and the things that are found are almost all worthwhile. Lester nods off for some time while sitting at the dining room table. There are 8 chairs around its perimeter, and it takes up almost the entire room. When he wakes, he sees a pair of his pants and underwear in the corner of the room where he tossed them some days before. For a moment, everything seems wrong to him, and ludicrous and far beyond repair. He laughs a strange laugh into the back of his hand, which becomes wet with his warm, ragged breath. What he does next shows remarkable presence of mind, not only because of the concentration which it requires, but also for the fact that for a minute or two, he forgets what it was that he so absolutely meant to do just a few minutes before, and then he remembers. He gathers from different rooms on whole different ends of the house, a pen and a yellow college-lined tablet, and then lurches toward the dining room table and quickly scribbles. This weariness is an ancient thing, the shoe-deep sadness of centuries, of places gone and people lost, and kerchiefs in train stations. Well, okay. Lester feels pretty pleased with this, but wonders, is it actually any good? He can't immediately think of anyone whose opinion he'd trust. It seems sort of bad, all in the same vein and not popping with fantastic juxtaposition like he's heard good poetry should. At least it got written down. He lays himself down on the ground, wriggles under the table, and puts the soles of his feet up against the table's belly. He wants to lift the whole thing off the ground, but the best he ever manages is 2 of its 4 legs. The table is very, very heavy, he realizes, decides. He stretches out, wraps his fingers slackly around the leg of one of the chairs, falls asleep, becomes unconscious. He doesn't feel very bad the next day, which of course sometimes happens. At some time during the evening he managed himself onto the living room sofa, a very short crawl from the dining room. He lies there now, staring at his foot propped up on the far upholstered arm, watches the wind in the trees through the wall of glass. There's a song in his head he composed in his sleep, very catchy and repetitious, with a chorus that goes like, "Hey there, la la, what the fuck?" He lunches on the remainders of a noodle dish he fixed a few days ago. He eats in the position he likes best, cross-legged on the floor with the dish sitting about a foot in front of where his ankles meet. He drinks ice water from a large plastic tumbler, refills it several times. At some point it comes to him, an idea in reaction to which he physically shrugs. He feels great. Outside he sits on a piece of the damp patio furniture, watches masses of fog move over the mountains, out past the poplars on the far side of his field. While he watches for an hour or more, the morning clears out into a temperate, sunny day, during which there is nothing in particular he has to do. He walks far off into the woods to where he hasn't ventured before, comes upon an old road that leads him to a dry gulch, where water runs sometimes but doesn't right now. Along the gulch, tall old trees lean in to catch the light and make a canopy high above him, pretty enough so that he walks along it for a while, constantly picking footholds on the loose stones that make up the creek bed. The path grows a little muddy, but otherwise disappears, until he's walking beside a utilitarian ditch in the middle of someone's pasture. Uphill in the field, he sees a pretty thing, a large leaning barn surrounded by trees and partly overtaken with ivy. He walks to it, feeling exposed in the wide clearing and huge blue sky. But soon enough he is at the barn, which is gnarled and dense and has apparently been left entirely to the elements. Inside there are implements of livestock restraint, old iron things hanging by chains from the ceiling, with a vague sense of threat, things that Lester doesn't really understand. He makes his way up the remaining stairs to the second level, which is cavernous and profound, with loose sections of the tin roof creaking in a wind so slight, this is the first Lester has noticed of it. Lester reaches the far wall of the barn, where a diamond-shaped window is cut into the boards. The whole of the valley opens itself up to him. It is all very green and lush, wide slats of yellow pasture weaved along the edges, and past a little stream of pavement he can see, in a moment of weird recognition, the roof of his house and the field behind it which he likes so well. How little he has actually walked, and just look at all of the things that he has seen. Chapter 9. At Astra. A rat's ass. Lester had a theory of the world which he had been working on for some time. On further reflection, perhaps this theory had just arrived upon him one day, and he had not yet discarded it. His theory did not deal with how the world actually operated. This was a matter of which Lester had long ago admitted virtual ignorance, but rather the way in which he perceived the world and his place within it. His ideas may seem familiar to you, though if not, you should probably not adopt them, as they have not been much tested in regard to soundness and safety. The world, Lester thought, was actually composed of two worlds to which he had given two cute names, Big World and Little World. Each of these worlds existed logically exclusive of the other, although there was room enough in his head to contain both, each in its own snug little chamber. Little World was the depressive one, where the whole sum of one's life left few lasting physical traces, and one was eventually nothing but third from the left in the last row of a family picture. Big World was a megalomaniac mind cut loose of any rational consideration, where every decision one made affected change in the lives of others, in ordinary fashions and also by more dubious, invisible paths of distribution. Everyday reality was a dull knit of the two worlds. At most, one had a glimpse of one or the other in the course of an average day. Say the vision of the foundation of one's home in an empty field dotted with bison, or the faint impression of a personal phraseology you had just abandoned, put to humorous effect on a television comedy. Either way, there were two worlds, each excruciating and uninhabitable for their intensity. The whole of one's lifetime effort leaving nothing but a black streak across a gray stone out in Wyoming somewhere, or else stepping out onto the porch each evening to see one's own signature done up with twinkling stars in an otherwise black sky. Better yet, and where we might part ways with our young hero, was that both Big World and Little World were indisputably real, a matter of little more than opinion, which of course everything is, with the exception of mathematics, which Lester wasn't any good at. Mountains are made of both basalt and raindrops. Out of vast forces is a single struggle made, the struggle that is us, and what we manage before we split open and our water washes away. Blah, blah, blah. A kegger is one thing. The amount spent on the keg, the head count, the couplings and fistfights which bloom there and prove worthy of remembrance. A party is one thing too, upon which all the world depends, that late alliances might yet be forged and possibilities engendered, that the world might be populated, and countless checks written to those tall buildings so very far away. Glimpses Lester has now and again of some legitimate worth, when not too taken with the expensive psychedelia of his own educated misunderstandings. He has dreams of literal distribution, big trucks back to the loading docks of metal buildings, and rough calculations of the boxes full of boxes inside, where the numbers seem too ludicrous, and somehow all the freight out on the interstate must be just decoys of our prosperity, with nothing inside but a hobo and a cook stove and a couple of cans of beans. As the weekend nears and the party with it, Lester swings from one camp to the other, sad and then expansive about things as they are. The day just before, though, he is plunged fantastically into Big World, his essence sunk crucially in the texture of everything he sees and hears. The feeling is so heady and strange that he imagines it must prefigure some crucial event, and that for some brief furlough time is running in both directions. What Lester feels, though, is nothing but himself, stirred after a long slumber. He is not the unknown quantity, but resides even deeper in the equation. One of his hands meddles on either side of the sign. Chapter 10. Poseurs, Dabblers, an illustrated history of numerals. Pete calls Lester on the day of the party to see if he is coming. He sounds very sweet and a bit nervous, that things will go well. Lester is more than a little pleased at the attention, and in return does his very best to put his old friend at ease. Pete finally comes around to the point that the person with the car that he and Tim were counting on to go and get the keg has had a change of heart. Or of plans, perhaps. Pete is flustered and it's hard to tell. So, could Lester possibly be so bothered? Lester does not put up much struggle because the suggestion so surprises his sensibilities. A few minutes later, Pete calls him back and says they found somebody else to do it, curtly apologizes for the hassle. Lester has considered for some time what to wear to the party at Pete's trailer, but after this second call his mood turns and he decides to downgrade his style quotient somewhat, picking finally some dark jeans and a worn gray t-shirt with the pocket partially come loose. It is a familiar summertime ensemble for him, and he knows he will feel at ease in it. He watches television until precisely 10, then drives the 45 minutes to Pete and Tim's. He knows the way well, but the landmarks have changed somewhat, disorienting his sense of time. His uniform impression of the changes wrought by the last few years is that things have, on balance, become uglier. Scenic little valleys he was once fond of have been stripped to their red clay underpinning, with bulldozers sitting around unattended in the waste, gloating over all they've ruined. There are now more trailers along the way too, many of which sit not 100 feet from the busy highway, perfect there for collecting both noise pollution and slaughtered house pets. The stupidity of these houses is so intense that after seeing the 6th or 7th example, Lester grips the steering wheel and howls, convulses his body back and forth. This response is too little to satisfy his sense of confusion, though, and he falls limply back into his seat, takes 10 deep breaths. Far into Newton County, past spooky hairpin curves on ancient pink asphalt, Lester comes to the dirt road which is the way to Pete's. From here on, things are more or less like he remembers, with a few exceptions, such as the dotting of each little homestead, now with a brilliant sulfur light up on a tall pole, so that certain mountainsides seem as studded with stars as the sky just above them. A mile or so further in, the nostalgia becomes achingly intense as Lester crosses the low-water bridge which fords the creek just before Pete's. This creek, which Lester has mostly forgotten until now, was the destination of many hikes down from the trailer. Here he and Pete collected crawdads in coffee cups, skipped rocks, waded, pursued all the wholesome hillbilly pastimes allowed children before they are old enough to go hunting. Lester and Pete came here far past childhood, though, too transfixed by childish pleasures. There are lots of cars for the party, a line of them along the ditch, to which Lester adds his own. The walk to the trailer allows Lester a few moments to collect himself and draw in the sounds of merriment, gauge its intensity before presenting himself. The party, even at this early hour, would appear to be rollicking, and above a dense murmur of voices he even hears one clearly articulated yee-haw. Lester wonders whether this state of affairs makes him feel more uneasy or less, but before he can decide, he is well within the gathering's perimeter, weak light from the trailer's windows silhouetting clumps of people with smoke whirling around their faces. This is the first and least intense circle of what looks to be a very large party. Persons at this distance unconcerned with the larger project at hand, and apparently just loitering here on the hoods of their automobiles. Better here than at some parking lot in town where the cops might hassle them. Next comes a clump of nervous, funny-looking males, talking in low voices to one another, wearing baseball caps and smoking with one hand, as they each hold a plastic cup of beer in their other. This group gives off a slight air of misery, so near the front door, yet not quite within it, and not one female voice in their murmur. They smile and nod vaguely at Lester, sharp little teeth. One gestures Lester toward the front door, with a roll of his shoulder. Lester makes a little two-finger salute to no noticeable effect, mounts the cinder block, and pulls the screen door open. Lester's head tends to enter a room a long time before the rest of him, casually surveying for danger before bringing the bigger bulk along. This is how he enters the trailer now, where things are very loud and even smokier. Two huge, long-bearded, very drunk men are taking turns hurling one another against the wall. Lester's body remains outside the doorway. "Hey! Hey!" a voice shouts. Lester looks over to see it is Tim, standing unsteadily from his chair, with one hand held in the air. One more shout, and he has their attention, continues. "What did I just tell you, fuckers? What did I just tell you about the wall? The two huge men stand panting in the small room, to Lester's eye absolutely identical, but for the plaid of their flannels. One of them bends down, wheezing with his hands on his knees, while the other stares unpleasantly at Tim with small, red, untamed eyes. "Don't ask me, Sasquatch," Tim answers in a low and even voice. They stare at each other a little more, and apparently Tim wins. The angry one pulls the wheezing one by the arm, and Lester jumps aside for them to exit, the wheezing one missing the cinder block altogether and falling down with a movement which strikes Lester as the very antithesis of grace. In the resulting commotion among the crowd outside, someone reflexively throws their beer in the air, and everyone shouts angrily. That sound soon settles into jokey laughter. Lester enters again. Tim sees Lester, gestures to him from the table where he is sitting, and Lester goes and stands beside him. A game of poker is taking place between 4 players, with 6 girls of average to above-average beauty sitting and standing around the periphery. They are playing with actual money, which isn't something Lester has seen with his own eyes before. In the pot there are many singles, several 5s, and even a 20 laid triumphantly on top. "Just want to use a prod with some people. Anybody who really knows me knows I'm not a guy really into my property as such," Tim says to no one in particular. "But some cracker tries to smash the very boundaries that I put my shit in, you know." "Amen," answers a mustached man in a denim jacket, folding. "I mean," Tim begins, "it's not like I'm so free of attachments I don't at least want a little plastic and cardboard between the television and my toilet, you know." The remainder of the hand passes in silence, finally goes to an obese person whom Lester cannot positively identify as male or female. As Tim deals the next hand, Lester begins to feel uncomfortable at just how long he has been standing there, unacknowledged. As he prepares to walk off, Tim throws him a "How you been, Les?" Lester answers, "Pretty well." Tim finishes dealing and looks up at Lester. Tim is pretty far gone, his neck loosely swaying, his purple eyeshadow dappled with sweat and badly smeared on the right side. He smiles at Lester gamely, pronounces, "Still cute." "Thanks," Lester answers. "So, where you been?" Tim asks, discarding 3 cards. "New York." The fat one lets a long whistle, apparently in response to Lester and not the cards. The sound is not sufficient for Lester to determine this person's gender. Tim gathers the discards, begins to deal again. "Good pussy up there?" he asks, and before Lester can fashion a reply, Tim continues, "Kegs in the tub. Think Pete's out back or out in the woods somewhere." Waiting around for his turn at the tap, Lester considers that Tim seems to have mellowed somewhat, although his overall manner can still only be described as decidedly hostile. The keg is going strong in the tiny, filthy bathroom, dark yellow beer and no foam. By the time his cup is full, Lester has thought about it more and decides the interaction he's just had with Tim isn't enough to draw solid conclusions. Lester exits back out the front door. Reflexively, even with all the intervening years, his foot still feels about for the cinder block. It is a lesson learned with many unpleasant errors and so, apparently, unforgettable. To Lester's eye, it is a different block than it used to be, unmuddied and whole. Lester walks around the side of the trailer, which seems to be no man's land so far as the party is concerned. The backyard contains a ripe and dense crowd, though. People arrayed there on various battered folding chairs, boundaries vaguely lit with 4 citronella candles. There is music back here, which with a song just ending Lester soon realizes is nothing more than the radio playing. The very prospect of this is so ludicrous that he must take a heady swig of his yellow beer. He passes through the crowd, looking about at the faces as stealthily as possible, and soon realizes that Pete is not among them. The people here look pleasant enough. Salt of the earth, but mostly attractive at least. And yet, despite everything, listening to the radio. Scanning intently, he runs full on into a woman of advancing middle age, overalls, and a blonde ponytail slung down the front of each of her shoulders. What should he say? She pushes him hard on the chest and gives him the finger. He feels clutching fear before he realizes she is both giggling and terribly drunk. In fact, only joshing him. He makes his way out of the backyard scene, advances on the wood where he knows the old road to begin. He calls into the darkness as quietly as he can while still shouting. Calls out, "Pete!" And then again, "Pete!" No answer that he can hear. He advances down the road and the forest closes above him as the party dwindles behind. Emboldened by the quiet, he calls out Pete's name again in a husky, angry voice, having a good time of it. Then faintly comes an answer. "What?" "Pete." "Yeah." This is all there is for a while. Lester walks further down the road, his eyes just starting to adjust to what little moonlight there is. Pete sounded as if he were straight ahead on the road, though probably still a fair distance off. Lester realizes he has forgotten exactly where this old road goes to, or how long it takes getting there. "Who's there?" Pete shouts. Lester halts and calls out his own name. "Oh!" Pete calls, and after a pause, Lester sees vague flashes of light in the trees ahead of him, which finally become the twin beams of two advancing flashlights. It is Pete, accompanied by someone Lester can just barely make out, a short and stocky male wearing a baseball cap. "Lester!" Pete shouts, then puts the flashlight under his chin and says, "Spooky! But look, it's just me, don't be scared." Pete and Lester briefly hug, largely from an obligation to do so. Lester cannot tell how Pete looks, though Pete inspects Lester up and down thoroughly with his flashlight. "We were about to drop," Pete says. "Would you like to join us?" "Drop?" "Acid." "Oh," Lester answers, then, "Oh ho ho, probably not. We have plenty, and there's more at the house too." "It would be bad. I mean, I think for me it would probably be a pretty bad idea." Lester sees the shadow which is Pete's head nod up and down. Pete then says, a certain jaunt to his manner, "Well, let's go then," and turns around back down the road, into the deeper forest. Lester walks behind Pete and the fellow to whom he has not yet been introduced, wonders where the three of them are all possibly headed to. The answer presents itself quickly enough, a large field which Lester recognizes immediately with a profound sense of well-being and proper placement. As Pete and his friend divvy up the acid, one holding the flashlight and both of them dickering, Lester looks about and thinks of how often he came here, and how time has not made the valley the least bit less spectacular. There are two large buildings lit up on the far-off hill which seem new to Lester, and whose presence seems out of place in the midst of the beauty. Lester asks Pete about them. "Broiler houses. They're putting them everywhere now, get-rich-quick schemes for the locals." "They're ugly," Lester says. "They're bad for the wells, too. All the chicken shit." The stocky one speaks, says, "Things are shitty in Chicken City." Pete and the stocky one laugh at this very hard, holding their sides and unable to stop. Lester laughs uncomfortably, wonders if this is all there is to the joke. While they laugh, Lester thinks for a moment that he sees someone standing off in the woods to the side of the clearing, watching the three of them. Lester is briefly startled, but a branch sways and he sees the vision for what it is, trees and shadows. His companions have stopped laughing and Pete tries to explain. "Last week, me and Evan." "Last week?" "Yeah, last week," Evan answers. "Yeah, last week we were tripping and sneaked up there. The chicken houses. We looked in the windows. I guess we spent a long time looking." "Hours," Evan answers. "Yeah, hours, until the sun came up, looking up there at all the thousands of chickens. We called it Chicken City, and we had all the chickens all talking to each other." Evan, barely able to speak, chokes out in a squeaky chicken voice, "I think I stepped in something." They start laughing again, really trying to stop. Evan lies down on the ground and puts his hands over his eyes. This spell lasts as long as the first one. That's what they kept saying, Pete struggles to say. One of the things we made them say. They must have... We said that 1,000 times. 1,000 times? Evan is still laughing, chokes out, I don't know. I hope Tim sells some of that acid tonight, Pete says. There's still a sheet left and I can't take another month like this last one. There won't be anything left of me. Everything will be funny if we keep up like we have been, Evan. Nothing won't be funny then. This sobers Evan somewhat, and he throws one forearm across his face, breathes athletically. Lester wonders if perhaps Pete and his friend are insane. There seems to be very little chance that they exist in the same world that Lester does. Given the circumstances of their life, he's been able to piece together so far. To look at Pete, though, now that Lester's eyes have adjusted, he looks to be the same as ever, a little healthier in build than he used to be, but still the same cheerfully incredulous expression that he's always worn. Lester doesn't know how to feel, he realizes. Everything here is so strange to him. It was mean of Tim, says Pete with an indignant edge to his voice. 2 sheets and nobody lined up. He knows how I am with the stuff. He could have hidden it, at least. You would have found it, Evan answers. He throws up a hand and Lester helps him to his feet. It's true. I know just where he'd hide it. They stand around for some time. The silence from his companions suggests to Lester that they are perhaps feeling the first effects. Lester hasn't touched the higher hallucinogens for probably 5 years. The prospect now frankly terrifies him. Wow, says Evan. He nods a goodbye to Lester, heads back toward the trailer. Lester looks over his shoulder and watches Evan's flashlight in the trees. Lester and Pete stand there for a long time, silent. Lester is determined to let Pete talk first. Feels like anything else would be disrespectful. While waiting, an idea comes upon Lester. This place was old as these hills, and had been this beautiful as far back as any history went. The field was probably wooded once, perhaps 100 years ago, before it was cleared for cattle. It was Pete's field now, and Pete had no cattle. I wonder what the strangest thing that ever happened here was, Lester muses to Pete, who is leaning handsomely, lankly, with his hands in the back pockets of his jeans. Pete shrugs. A human sacrifice? Lester offers. A spacecraft landing on 3 legs? The field seemed an appropriate place for either. There were things rarer, though. A thing that happened with an atom only once in 1,000 years. Pete had seen it on the television, on the edge of a coastal shelf somewhere. This place where 24 scientists monitored a square mile of supercompacted seawater with all of mankind's most sensitive instruments, a trillion atoms for maybe 20 years, and nary a twitch of this one thing that sometimes happened with atoms, only blind white fish seeking the heat of the floodlights. But surely one of those had happened here, Pete thought, or maybe even 2 on the same day. Whatever it was, Pete answered, it's not something that we could ever understand. Lester feels slighted, thinks Pete is dismissing his question out of hand. He shouldn't have said anything. He remembers deciding he wouldn't. Sorry, Lester says. Pete turns toward him, smiling. What? Pete asks. Nothing. Where's Evan? He went back to the trailer. Really? When did he do that? While back. Weird. He does that, he just goes away. Evan's essence, Lester says, feeling fairly certain that he is the only person in the entire world. Yeah, sometimes Evan just disappears. Chapter 11. Casual use of the phrase, late capitalism. Lester drinks, the party swells. The temper of the crowd changes somewhat toward the ugly side. Another keg has arrived, the rumor is in the air, and everyone seems determined to see the thing to its undoubtedly bitter end. One girl, stringy brown hair and a social worker demeanor, tries to get Lester to get up from his lawn chair and dancing along to the radio. Drunk and well past caring, he merely stares her down to where she lets loose of his hand. Alcohol, Lester thinks, is a very good drug. Perhaps it is the only drug of lasting use and worth to people all around the globe. Cheap, simple to manufacture, graceful to consume. Lester wasted many perfectly good hours of his college career plotting out the difference between marijuana and alcohol to himself, and why one was currently considered naughtier than the other. His conclusion, as far as he cares to remember, was that while drunk, you were more likely to have sex than while you were high. These things were doubtless crucial to the powers that be. Lester becomes drunk. In his drunkenness, Lester feels a security that extends beyond physical well-being and cheery forgetfulness, deep into the very mechanisms by which the world is held in one piece. Death is but a portal into wider expanses, and injustice in this world, the illustrative example by which the next is corrected. These are the best thoughts that anyone has ever thought, mere religious homilies. Lester thinks he will have to pay a good deal more attention to, perhaps tomorrow. Lester goes and mingles among the people. This, for the most part, involves standing at the edge of their clusters, nodding every now and then as someone is talking and laughing at the same time that everyone else does. This is less embarrassing than it sounds, given both Lester's intoxication and the loose composition of the crowd, there being no strictly defined alliances that he can observe. Upon reflection, when reflection comes the next day, Lester cannot remember a single subject that was discussed among these small clumps of party-goers. This is not alcoholic blackout, for Lester remembers most everything else of what happened in the course of the night. Rather, it is a function of the conversations themselves. He has a sense of this, even as the conversations are taking place, the sense of no information being conveyed, but rather faint popular notions being set before the crowd, and then either being played up or down, with another presenting itself as easily, usually even before, any individual opinions are nailed down on the previous topic. This is not a mode of communication with which Lester is familiar, and so his involvement, aside from the nodding and general assent earlier described, becomes one of almost anthropological observance. What precisely is taking place here? To what end do they speak, if not to actually say things? The impression he receives is comfort. Fellow creatures warm about you and behaving more friendly than not. It is a feeling he eventually will leave the party with as well, though not through this diffuse patter. No. What happens to Lester is that he talks, he opens the box, and it rolls out as trippingly as it can, on only the tongues of the drunk or godstruck. The opportunity presents itself at the edge of one of these banal little campfires. Lester talks first, is perhaps a bit rude for nervousness, but soon enough settles himself and his lucky vessel into some jerry-rigged understanding. The subject is a chubby fellow, effuse breasts pushing against the cloth of his shirt, and below them a sizable projection of belly over the natural limit of his vertical plane. His face is intelligent and kind, wide, soft, and ringed, with a shaggy beard of rather Amish appearance. Lester gets the sense that he is slightly older than the subject. When Lester begins to speak with him, the boy seems slightly taken aback, but manages to cover his surprise with a jovial, vaguely jiggling shifting of his frame to face Lester directly, a gesture that seems to say, "That was how it was before, but it seems that this is how it is now." "Are you enjoying the party, sir?" Lester asks. "Oh yes, by all means." "I suppose you attend a lot of these functions." "My share. Perhaps more." The timing of this response is so well delivered, Lester is momentarily dumbstruck. He successfully passes off his confusion as an attack of gas, tapping himself repeatedly on the breastbone with his forefinger. When recovered, he continues, "And how do you find this one? How does it, as they say, measure up?" "They have good parties here. You see a lot of people that you don't see other places. You, for example. I am new to these parts, Lester assents. Or rather, newly new. Moved away for some time and just moved back. How are you finding it? Peaceful, Lester decides after some thought. From the look on your face, I thought you might say boring. No, it isn't that, not quite. For a moment, the wheel of the conversation halts, and they look at one another pleasantly, pleased that they will soon be talking again. Lester feels happier than he has for several months. Dennis, says the young man, putting his hand forward in a fevered way. And my name is Lester, Lester says, taking that hand with jolly ferocity. Dennis notices the state of Lester's drink and leaves to get them both refills. In the interim, Lester looks at the partygoers shuffled about in their various attitudes, wonders at the profusion of immediate detail and his mind's ability to ignore almost all of it. He considers himself as merely an animal, and at that, not even a productive member of a questionably successful species. Dennis returns with the beers. Do you know the converts? Lester asks. I know Tim slightly through my brother. They went to school together. What's your brother's name? Frank Wilburn. Lester shakes his head, shrugs. He says, I worry about Pete, Tim's little brother. Yeah, I know Pete too. He just does drugs like his main thing, Lester says. That's not uncommon, Dennis answers. I suppose, Lester says, feeling some weird relief at this notion. I don't think he's ever worked. He hasn't, and neither has Tim. I've heard Tim brag about it. How do they do it then? Lester asks, his nape hairs prickling at the unpleasant possibilities. Tim deals? Tim only deals to friends, and not usually for a profit, I think. It's a matter of some discussion where their money comes from, actually. People are curious. It isn't as if they have a garden or hunt or anything. They don't seem to have the most extravagant lifestyle. They're both really skinny, Dennis says. Lester nods. Best theory I've heard is it's their dad. He sends them a check, Dennis says. He's down with some weird shit out west, apparently. Did you know Pete doesn't know who his mom is? Lester chimes in brightly. As soon as he says this, he wishes that he hadn't. He's drunk, but still realizes that this is unforgivable. His stomach knots. Yeah, I knew that. Tim has met his, but Pete doesn't know his, and the old man never even told Pete who she was. Whew. Things have apparently loosened up some since Lester's been gone. This whole subject used to be a matter of the greatest humiliation for Pete. The facts only tearfully surrendered to Lester after they'd known one another for almost 2 years. Apparently Pete's gotten a little distance and humor on the weirdness, or maybe the secret just got out. Something like that's got to warp a kid, Dennis says softly, faintly grinning, leaning drunkenly toward Lester. Now at least Lester was getting drunk with someone. Toward this goal they cajoled and humored one another, until the goal itself diminished in their minds, and the whole evening became a sort of vortex at the edge of which they'd lost their step. Lester found it harder and harder to determine whether he was saying things of any quality or interest, and Dennis only seemed to be laughing harder and harder at everything that he said. At one point, they were walking and talking to one another, and only when they reached the bushes at the edge of the yard did Lester learn why they had been walking that way in the first place, for Dennis began vomiting there, in a very unassuming manner. Lester patted him on the back as the deed was slowly completed, and after Dennis had wiped the corners of his mouth with his forefinger and thumb, he looked no different than he had before. After that, they lay down on the yard some distance away from the vomit, hoping perhaps that the world might regain some of its stability. The night sky hung majestically empty and remote, almost intentionally so. The concerns of petty flesh seemed less serious. They lay on their backs on a slight incline and could still hear the party, the caw now and again of individual voices. "World's confusing," Dennis said. "Now especially," Lester lunged, sensing an opening. "The end of an era, everything prepared to change in gigantic ways." "Do you think?" "Not really," Lester answered with a funny quickness. "It is a dynamo, this one, this late capitalism. The train we never intended to build steaming toward the unbridged canyon, the much-anticipated and merciful rupture." Where were these words coming from? "Nothing's wrong," Dennis pronounced after a long silence. "That's the problem." Neither of them moved nor spoke one word for a very long time. Chapter 12. Of Lynyrd Skynyrd and two strange presidential candidates with the same first name. "Almost lost you there," said Dennis, pushing Lester back into consciousness. Lester looked at him with moist, bleary eyes. Dennis was lying on his side, his head propped up on his left hand, while his right prodded at Lester with the fingers extended. For a moment, there was a dense, strange intimacy between them. In answer, Dennis sniffled and sat up, dug in his pocket, and produced a cloth handkerchief into which he noisily blew his nose. "Allergies," he mumbled over his shoulder. "How long was I out?" Lester asked, looking at Dennis's fat shoulder blades. "Dunno, 5 minutes." On the radio was the song Sweet Home Alabama, and some girls were singing along to the chorus. The sound of the mixed voices was wonderful. It was the sound of the spirit of the song itself. Amped-up spasm instruments being played in a tin-roof general store. Lester sat up beside Dennis. "Funny thing, this song," said Lester. "Everyone acts as if there were something very crucial about it. Theme song for that bastard hologram, the New South. No one realizes it's about people who had the good sense to leave Alabama, but who like going back occasionally to see the alligators and to eat food made in unhygienic kitchens." "Is it? Well, that's one part. Big wheels keep on turning. You can almost see him in his wide-brimmed hat on the Greyhound, little baggy in his breast pocket to see him through the holidays. There's a diss on Neil Young, too, for giving the South a hard time in Southern Man and Alabama, which are, to be honest, pretty stupid songs. Indignation in the face of racism and social inequity in the Deep South being a bit like waving one's fist at Mont Blanc for being so damn large. Dennis smiled at Lester, something in this expression allowing Lester free range to expand, grow big as he saw fit. Not much came of the rivalry, though. No southeast-northwest coastal conflict, as both parties were, I think, more interested in acquiring more capital than protecting their rep. You'll find such behavior endemic among the whites. "Yes," said Dennis, holding his chin. "Yes. The royalties are still rolling in, of course. Your ears can judge that. Skynyrd does the whole situation one level better, gentle souls, in a few well-laid words explaining the whole system as it was in the 70s, as it remains today." Then in a sweet warble, Lester sings, "In Birmingham, they love the governor. Boo, boo, boo. Boo, boo, boo," Dennis asks. "I thought it was just ooh, ooh, ooh." "It isn't." "No?" "Honest, I mean it can sound like either, but in context, boo is what's called for." "Okay. Do you know who the governor of Alabama was in those days?" "I do not." "His name was George Wallace, overseer of a whole dynastic age in Alabama politics. He served like 12 years as governor, and after that he ran his wife in his place. Then she served titular head while he did all the deals. A monster of another age, consummate master of what today we call hate politics, basically hitting the county fair circuit and yelling nigger as loud as the PA system would allow. That in mind, consider the next line. Again, Lester sings, "Now we all did what we could do." Isn't it sweet? Isn't it humble? 1972 was a hard year for the US of A, mass disillusionment, shit hitting the bricks all over the place. George Wallace and George McGovern, who I still get confused, had battled for the Democratic nomination, across a ludicrous wide gap of ideological poles. McGovern got smeared by Nixon, and Wallace got a bullet in the gut, a severed spine, could never fuck again. Then what? Well, 73, of course, and from bad to much, much worse. Now Lester sings very sweetly, a serenade almost, not just to Dennis, who still seems to be following along, but to the world, the very world. Watergate does not bother me. Do you see? Lester fairly shouts. Corruption in the pucker of the Mason-Dixon crack? Not much shock to a Southern man, see? But then, oh boy, let's leave all this behind. Whiny Neil Young, and even this stunning prescience of American politics for a quarter century to come. No. Skynyrd then goes on so far as to play the fucking shepherd to his goddamn flock. Does your conscience bother you? Tell me true. Huh, Dennis answers. Lester falls back on the grass, folds his hands across his chest, very giddy, although not exactly happy. How do you know all that stuff? Dennis asks. It's public information. But I mean, why? I don't know. This is not the truth. The whole routine was, in fact, an American Studies paper which Lester wrote in college and loved dearly, but made a B- on. The professor took her ridiculous discipline very seriously, as it turned out, and he spent several nights vaguely insomniac over the injustice that had been done him, until finally he took it up with the professor in her office, and the earnestness he displayed there earned him a whole letter grade higher, although the begging led also to a slight diminution of his self-respect. It clings within him to this day, this episode roundly forgettable, like so much of the contents of his college years. For instance, the swirling shape of Mont Blanc was fixed even now in his memory, a glossy plate pasted to the page of a 19th century travelogue. Now he was here, wallowing in his relative uniqueness among people whose years had been spent in similar ways, but in more practical surroundings, their energies invested in things like minor auto repairs and sending off the cable bill. He felt ashamed to even indulge consideration of these differences, not so much guilty in the face of his privileges as morally opposed to the likelihood that those differences represented any actual worth, aside from a smarmily material one. The problem was that the thoughts appeared anyway, inescapable, a finger-smudged wall in a hall of mirrors. Lester comforted himself with the soft notion that things could be more than one way. He didn't think that all ideas were of equal merit, but sensed that specific interstices, at the edges of large concepts, were infinitely fluid and giving, so that one well-formed and worthwhile idea might not rub upon another, and in the process damage both. That he could both love and sometimes fundamentally disrespect his surroundings, and even the people inhabiting them, was not a large intellectual issue for Lester. It was a part of his mind where the passage was wide enough to take traffic going in either direction. It was like the word whatever, the recently ballyhooed cry of American youth, which if one said it while smiling and shrugging, meant a lame disinterest in didactic goals. But if said with tears and furrowed brows, it became, almost miraculously, a singular declaration of love. This was the manner in which anyone navigated the world, of course, scanning out the potentialities and slowly, painfully reconciling them into a reality sturdy enough to live inside. It was rare enough for Lester to actually live one of these evenings of mere luxurious fact-finding, to set aside his calculations and instructions and go flailing about in places where one's expectations were roundly confounded. More, he realized, some brave and mysterious souls managed to spend their whole lives out here. What more? 2 hours later, the gathering was breaking up, more an inevitable than regretful air among the persons shuffling back to their automobiles. Dennis led Lester to his automobile, which was a motorcycle, an ancient BMW which Dennis had the hardest time getting started. As Dennis stood panting after many unsuccessful attempts, Lester felt obligated, though it came across rather more flip than he intended, to say that the motorcycle at least looked very impressive. It started, though, finally, and they spoke over a clatter, compounded by the revving with which Dennis kept it viable. "Will I see you again?" Lester shouted. An odd look from Dennis, mercifully quick. A nod, then. "I work at Wendy's, in town." "Really?" Lester answers, then feels bad for the tone. "I don't—" Dennis retreats, makes a burger-flipping motion. "I manage. I tell other people to do it. I count out the registers." The pause is difficult, each of them attempting to judge the presence of prejudice, the impression of prejudice, the real importance of either. A smile from them each settles it, though not very comfortably. Dennis revs and drives off, the irregular rumble of his engine settling into the early morning, and soon enough, it passes altogether. After this scene is settled, Lester goes out in search of Pete, whom he finds behind the trailer with Evan and a couple of stragglers. "You're still here?" Pete marvels. "Yeah." "You have fun? Where you been?" "It was a good party," Lester insists, all but apologizes. He stands about for some time as Pete and Evan chat to one another about the pattern the light from the trailer window makes on the grass, which they believe resembles a large, scary face. Lester can't see it, himself. Lester touches Pete softly on his narrow back, gets a serious nod, and even a merrily raised hand in response. Debt settled, Lester keeps thinking on the drive home. Chapter 13. The Scenery and Oneself. For half a week following the party, the remembered contents of that evening mingle freely with Lester's dreams. The dreams mimic the reality so precisely and subtly that the line between the two becomes superfluous. It is an interesting, funny thing and not a process with which he is in any way displeased. In the confusion, lived life is elevated to the mythic, and the world shimmers with willingness. His dirty clothes spread about the room appear, one morning, almost artfully arranged. Lester is not one to hate the world. The vitriol is generally directed inward. Lester actually counts this tendency to his credit, his overwhelming desire to ultimately be, in the great reckoning, harmless. Right now his relationship is very much to the world itself, and very little toward his place within it. We might even go so far as to posit, as Lester never would himself, that his self-hate is one of his more redeeming traits, so far as it is utterly consistent and, in his own conception of the good, relatively harmless. Lester loves the world, and indeed the world we find ourselves in is a limitless and beautiful place. Lester has cried in front of paintings in European capitals, has wandered drunk and dejected in ancient streets while managing to not make a nuisance of himself. Bless the boy. Surely, though he does not in the least suspect it, this is a path taking him toward a deep and enviable maturity, should he prove strong enough to weather it until inevitably happier days. We do worry about him sometimes, though, his frame so slight, and the wind lashing his long coat about so unkindly. The day will come, one supposes, when Lester will come to see himself as he is, a part of the world which he so adores and fears, and perhaps he will even now and again think upon himself as one of the more remarkable and irreconcilable objects that a beleaguered citizen's eyes might pass over in the course of an average day. He already is, of course, and more lovely for the fact that he does not yet know it. When he realizes he will assume a slightly smug air, and will no longer be ours to marvel at, but his own plaything. 3 unmerciful decades in the making. He will anticipate, and we will reminisce, and no one will be much the poorer. For a while now, Lester isn't worried about anything but for the day this feeling will end, this sturdy sense of well-being and calm. Nothing in his exterior world changes, Even under observation, we could not detect a difference except perhaps a certain slowness in the manner which he moves from room to room in his house, the quickness with which he falls asleep, and the stillness of his limbs as he lies unconscious. This is what we would see, and it would be stupid, meaningless, far from the wondrous jungle which has bloomed inside of him, where before there were only dry fronds and the occasional scratch of crickets. He drives in his hometown, takes long detours in order to breathe in the detritus and nostalgia there. How much the place has changed. The past feels different. There is something present in memory that appears in everyday life, rarely, when one's actions feel inevitable, played out in advance. Lester imagines this thing sometimes, as he wanders in the past, imagines himself in those near dozen bedrooms where he has lived these last 7 years or so. What he seeks to pin in his memory of each of these rooms is their essence, that soft-bellied thing, though it feels much more definite than that to him. Something between their smell and the heat sunlight made, as it lengthened through the morning and the air expanded. It is such a sweet exercise, an entirely personal indulgence. These signs were planned in advance, drawn in schematic form, argued over, settled, and executed. Each brick in each building was a personal toil, a manner in which to mark the passing of minutes. In everything in every city is the human, too intimate in its fallibility and too improbable in its genius. To enter the walls of a city is to enter into the arms of family, to tangle in the guile of those who would comfort and pretend to know you. His exit from town is always through fast food alley, tight orbits having consolidated his gravity and finally flung him out into the stricter logic of wilderness and agriculture. He passes the row of squat buildings beneath tall signs, the only difference between their products some representation of the ineffable. He considers each as the product of some immense effort, some brilliantly unfathomable efficiency, which he must admit he comprehends just as little as he respects it. In catering to the basest needs of the customer unfailingly, methodically, the 1-minute burger is a meaty kiss from the universe. Rest assured, a week hence Lester will pass this way again, and will think of things less kindly. Chapter 14. Lester receives an unexpected phone call. That week? Sheesh, who knows? Groceries at one point, bags and bags of them. Goods for some conjectural cooking from scratch, which he always intends to do, but ever more rarely materializes, and also a great pile of beef and chicken pot pies in individual cardboard boxes, which will not last out the week. He feels shame not so much for living the degenerate bachelor lifestyle, but for living such a precisely cliched version of it. One evening the phone rings, as it does from time to time, and oddly enough, it is not Lester's parents with gently concerned questions, but Lester's friend Sully from the city, with tales to tell of significant comings and goings among the people whom Lester thinks of all the time, his lost compatriots there. It makes some sense that Sully would be the one to call, slightly older than the rest of the circle, and certainly the wisest of them, warm and consoling. His voice has a deep sardonic timbre, and the well-turned nuances are a welcome thing to Lester's ears, worn raw as they are by the hickish saws of rural shopkeepes. You left. By all means, congratulations. Thanks, Lester says, pacing with excitement. It wasn't the easiest thing I've ever done, but far from the most difficult. This city's a prison built by its inmates, of course. Who said that first, I wonder? Smart guy, whoever. Smarter than I'd ever want to be, I'm sure. Is it scenic there? God, yes. The forests have all grown back up from where you fuckers clear-cut them. And so we shall again, but not quite yet, not as Lester frolics there and enjoys their shade. Sully sometimes made Lester feel as if he were a balloon into which character was being pumped, and at parting there was always a sense of decompression, the return to reckoning with his own dull self. He usually felt honored just to putter about with Sully for a minute or two at the bar, and so a personal payphone call was quite beyond his expectations. "Your father was very charming," Sully continued, "and he told me to tell you to go back to school. I asked him in what, and he wasn't certain. That's the rub, of course. You left so quickly. I'd only just heard about it, and then you weren't here anymore. Like pulling off a Band-Aid, see? Of course. If I might be so brusque, it wasn't some form of freak-out, was it? I heard no rumors, but thought people might just be respecting your privacy, as unlikely as that notion sounds among our gang. No, it was actually a pretty well-reasoned thing. An inheritance, actually." "Go on! You do know how to be interesting, don't you, Lester?" Lester was about to argue this point away from Sully, but he failed to interrupt him. "Speaking of freakouts, did you hear about Trina?" "I've hardly heard anything from anyone." "Well, she went the whole package over that one boyfriend of hers, that stockbroker who fell down the stairs at that party once." "Whole package? Trina went nuts?" "Well, she's mostly better now, I hear. She's with her grandmother out in New Mexico currently, drinking margaritas and gaining, perspective. That's awful, I think. If Trina can go, I'd say anyone can. It happens, though, doesn't it? When I go, at least I hope I go laughing. What's really interesting is that I hear she didn't play her sanity out with the standard waspy "I'm the mother of God" tableau, but actually went with an overlay of Norse gods. Apparently, he was Odin, and she was, well, Freya, or whoever Odin's lady was, and all the rest of us were Nibelungen and Gollumses of varying import. So charming, isn't she? Such a live one. Her shrink will probably wind up writing a paper about her. It was difficult for Lester to make a realistic picture of any of this, as his empathy for the gang's manner of exaggeration had atrophied somewhat. As the conversation continued, it became clear that Sully wanted his opinion, as a relative outsider, as to whether it would be too evil of him to make a trip out to see Trina, and, given her currently diminished psychic defenses, finally make a go of seducing her, as by his account Sully had long aspired to do. For far longer, in fact, than Lester had known either one of them. Lester, doing his best to avoid feeling used by Sully, suggested that perhaps at a time like this, Trina would be pleased to see a friend no matter what their intentions, and Sully for his part might do well to think less in purely acquisitive terms, and instead regard Trina more as a person currently down on her luck, who could doubtless benefit from his attention. "Of course," Sully answered after a pause. "You are a genius in your staid way, Lester. If I go just because I smell blood, she will surely smell the wickedness on me, and there goes my chance of having her. It's all a matter of the thoughts in my head at the approach, and if those manage to be pure enough, then my aim might as well be true." Lester couldn't tell whether Sully was joking, and worse, whether Sully was perhaps simultaneously joking and making fun of Lester's advice. This was silly, of course. It was Sully's dime, and people just talked to one another, didn't they? Messy motivations were too deep-seated to be taken on the immediate personal level. It was just that Sully was so intimidating, the way he got away with wearing decorative scarves in almost ascot configurations, the way he once picked up the tiny Casio keyboard off of Lester's coffee table and produced a whole minute of perfectly passable Rhapsody in Blue. "Have you been socializing?" Sully asked. "A bit." "A bit? Come on, son, we miss you," Sully said, and so blew every self-conscious thought from Lester's mind. The natural tendency is to talk about the person not present, but of you we always have such nice things to say. You must tell me you feel very unhappy where you are, and will be coming back to us very soon. You must tell me that so I can relay it to the others, and we can all feel the least bit hopeful about our prospects again. This continual hum of playful exaggeration, punctuated by bursts of subtle bitchiness, was the voice of his friends in the city. Each loose social knit in his experience had some such combination of characteristics so that its members might recognize one another and defend themselves against interlopers, a sort of secret handshake. Other schema to which Lester had fitted himself in the past were his college experience of extreme aloofness, combined with bouts of intense emotional honesty and, least to his liking, his first unit in the city, who had evinced a paralyzing nervous shyness whenever they were not making some nakedly contemptuous criticism of the people about them. For some time Lester had thought these forms represented some actual and meaningful difference in social groupings, accurately reflecting the natures of the persons within, but upon befriending the individuals who were its minions, he discovered them all to be very dissimilar, and the thing itself, nothing but play-acting writ large, some endlessly complicated manifestation of the pecking order. Learning this was some relief, because it allowed him to play along, but it was also damned upsetting to think of the terrible amount of effort everyone expended maintaining the facade. It was so baroque, and no one kept good track of it, and ultimately it led to no goal whatsoever, but its own ridiculous continuance. Thinking all this, though of course in none so conscious terms, Lester found himself saying what he said next, and apparently making up his mind. I think I will be here for some time longer, most likely. I have no plans right now to return. My God! Sully fairly exploded. Is it as great as all of that? It's far from great, Lester chuckled. But I don't think that's probably the issue, is it? Is that what we do, Sully? Go around looking for things to be great. Always being so terribly interested by everything all the time. Always pleased just to the point of busting. Christ, that's always kind of what I figured. Sully's quickness put Lester off his mark. Worse, Sully gleefully continued, lilting out some pretty argument that he seemed to be reading from a length of prepared script. All we know in this world is ourselves. All that we do here is toward the realization of self, and that is the only goal which any thinking person can accept the worth of. So has it been for centuries. Lester wasn't really sure how they'd gotten to this point, but he also got the sense that he had to respond in kind, and as quickly as possible. This caused him to blurt, quite passionately, I'm not talking about the cave. I'm talking about the garden. This is how it is when two souls given to introspection attempt to discuss those old dry issues which they, for always peculiar reasons, hold closest to their hearts. Each mind, at the prompting of the other, attempts to beat down the sharp-toothed figures that rise up from the ground, cackling and waving about their horrible claws. Neither of them is speaking about anything but the promptings of their own imaginations, but as the thing cools and the relation is mended, each party comes away with the sense that something important has been settled. Perhaps, Sully answered. Every object is full of complexities. I picked up a rock yesterday, a rock with some moss growing on the side of it, and I stared at it for 20 minutes. See, Lester, this bothers me. And what do you have, anyway? You have your Wonder City. You have your nozzle of critical worth that you suck your every last notion out of. Some vast labyrinth of shared preconceptions you pay homage to, because it decided to give you a desk job and an apartment. You read about the artist in the magazine. Then you go to the gallery, and you sigh in front of the paintings, and think about all the things you read about the artist in the magazine. And then you think I'm living in the cave. Okay, what cave, Lester? Plato's cave. I didn't even mention the cave. You meant it, though. Maybe I meant something about a cave, Lester. I really think you're being a bit high-minded, though. I mean, rocks are pretty. I'm sure all kinds of people like looking at rocks. I enjoy it, Lester asserted proudly. I probably would too, given the chance. You might have to help me a little at first, like point out the really good ones, and sooner or later I'd start to, develop my own critical faculties. But that's the thing, Lester struggled. You'd know on your own. You'd just see. No, there isn't any just see. You're looking at this rock, Lester, and you're seeing color harmonies and texture and all that other shit. But all that appreciation isn't coming from the rock, Lester. It's just a little interior decorator inside you, trying to break free. Perhaps. No such, Lester. You are a product of the culture. A finely honed aesthetic machine, bub. When the American Indians were running free around the scrub back whenever. See, they weren't looking at the sunset and sighing. They just knew. That meant it was getting cold pretty soon. And it was time to build a fire. When they took it into their heads to draw a picture of something, it was a big meat-bearing animal. Something they could appreciate. You sound awfully sure about this. Well, I'm not. Somehow you've wrangled me into defending a whole heap of things I don't like. It's this antagonism thing we always manage to hustle up between ourselves. We have to have something to talk about. Yes, Sully said, stretching the word. Though I suppose you've been doing well enough without our little chats, just staring at the rocks. Animal husbandry and light manufacturing down there? Lester answers. Backyard gardens. Gas station attendants. Fast food. Lester imagines them as two barrel-chested opera singers who had come together from opposite sides of the stage, each slowly lifting their upstage hand in the air while holding an uncomfortable note beyond the range of explicable endurance. I should go, Sully answered. I'll let all of our friends know you think they're deluded. Yes, do that. Also pretentious. See how that goes over. Get sick of it soon, okay? I will. I haven't realized it yet, but yes. After the conversation had ended, Lester stood for a while and looked about the kitchen, the place where the closest phone had been. He went over the ground they'd both covered, even tallied up the best things that each of them had said in the course of it. There was much in the chat, he thought, new things to contemplate and gently stir him. He wanted to remember everything, but he was already forgetting. In the arid field of his solitude, which stretched out for days and weeks ahead, those words could take no root. Chapter 15. Where even Sprawl struggles. The next morning Lester sleeps in and has a wondrous, meaningless dream. The tense of his dream is set slightly in the future, which will of course be a better place than the present. The dream starts with a large library, semi-private, though the public-private distinction seems to have slackened somewhat in the face of all the future wondrousness. Lester walks between fluorescent-lit shelves down a carpeted aisle. Sturdy, institutional bookshelves swoop up to a high ceiling on either side of him, and as he walks, he appreciates the space and the way the cheap lighting looks sharp in it. After the library, which stretches for 100 feet or so, there is a pair of metal doors with crash bars and then a big room with wood-paneled walls. There are wavering lights on the walls, yellow reflections of ripples from the huge aquariums which sit in the middle of the room. There are attendants here and there, clipboards at their sides, but they do not seem overly concerned with their work. They lean and yawn, speak to one another in quiet voices. Inside of the tanks, jellyfish, squid, and squint-pupiled octopodes float over shiny metallic strips whose surfaces glint in prismatic configurations. In his dream understanding, Lester knows that these are actually musical instruments specially built to be used by the bodies of these creatures, and the music they are making is everywhere in the air, overlapping and immediately recognizable melodies, Vivaldi and Bach. The sea creatures show no sign of being at particular attention while playing, and their renditions are mere memorized mimicry, like the spiritless work of an idiot savant. And yet they are playing these songs, even making mistakes now and then. The dream pleases him, and he hates to see it go, hates to feel it slowly pulled apart at its speculative hinges. He lies still and dutifully catalogues its content, remarkably weird and dense, thinks still further back into it and remembers the first part, his beautiful semi-private library. How real it was to him, is now almost a painful feeling, and Lester feels sad that he may never travel there again. After having such a pretty dream, he feels pleased with himself for the rest of the morning. He wishes he had had the dream the day before, so he might have told Sully about it when he'd called. Probably, though, it would have not come off right in the description, and his friend would have thought Lester to be even worse off than previously imagined. In his happiness, Lester is able to conclude that he's better off with things as they are. He wants to see Dennis, drives into town to see him. His numerous trips down Fast Food Alley in the past week were actually taken with the hope of perhaps seeing Dennis's motorcycle parked in the Wendy's lot, and, on this thin pretense, going in to visit him. The motorcycle was never there, though, even on the 2 tense occasions when he circled the entire lot. Driving up this afternoon, the motorcycle isn't there, but Lester goes in anyway. He supposes he might leave a note for Dennis or something, but it turns out that Dennis is behind the counter, joking with a woman in her 30s, who smiles at something he's just said, displaying her large, discolored teeth. It's about 3, and the dining area of the restaurant is completely empty. Dennis swings his head at the sound of the door and literally jumps to face Lester. He says, "Hey!" Lester lifts his hand, lopes over. The woman walks off into the kitchen area. Dennis looks happy enough to see Lester, grinning in his manager's shirt of blue vertical stripes with a black bow tie. His exposed forearms are very hairy, and his tucked-in shirt tails accentuate the stomach. Lester feels very large, makes a sweeping gesture with his left arm to take in the room. "Busy," Lester says. "Never, not even at lunchtime." "Convenient for you, I guess. We've been talking about getting a TV in back, just joking mainly. You're the boss, though, right?" Dennis takes this very well, nodding with satisfaction. "Yeah," he answers, as if reluctantly. "How you been?" "Well," Lester thinks fondly of his jellyfish dream. "Busy?" "Nope. Makes you wonder who is." Dennis confesses he worries that the restaurant is going to go out of business sometime, which would be a shame because he makes fairly good money here and doesn't particularly have to work. They talk about other odd business ventures in the area, which have held on for years for no clear reason, but the difficulties their owners would face in shutting them down. The adult world is a bizarre thing, they agree, and debt is perhaps its greatest and most flexible mystery. Surely it is so, for failure looms up everywhere. Dennis leans over with an eyebrow wiggle and asks if Lester would like some free food. Dennis makes fries and stacks them on a tray all on their own, a ridiculous large pile as it turns out, and so hot they're vaguely painful to eat. Lester takes the tray to the far end of the dining area, watches the traffic through the window, and eats the fries. Lots of pickups speed by. 2 customers come in, an elderly couple who move about with short, painful little steps. They are nice to watch, the way they move together, with the man just slightly behind the woman, her weak flank covered. He is so protective of her, even though a strong wind would probably be enough to topple them both. Middle-class effect, small pheasant feathers in the old man's hat. They have walked around this way for so many years that they probably don't even consider how poignant they look together, if they ever did. Lester watches Dennis as he gently wrings an order out of the couple. He changes as he serves them, becomes service-oriented. There is something unpleasantly effeminate about the expression he wears with them, the way he uses his entire face. Lester looks back at the road with a jerk as if he has seen something forbidden, an illicit glimpse of his grandmother's breast. Outside, a truck full of chicken cages is smoking up the 4-lane. The head of an occasional dead chicken hangs from the bars of the small stacked cages, swinging. The truck is moving very slowly and blowing black smoke, so Lester gets a good gander at the spectacle, a death ship of poultry. The elderly couple is seated now. The music in the place is loud and lousy, miserable commercial ventures of simplistic intent. To listen to their lyrics, one would think the whole world knew nothing but love. Lester eats fries through 4 songs and still does not eat a dent in the pile that Dennis gave him. He returns to the counter vanquished, offers up the remains. "What am I supposed to do with that?" Dennis asks in a not altogether playful tone. "You don't want any? I eat enough fries, I assure you." Lester busses the tray with Dennis watching, and now also the lady with noteworthy teeth. "When does this place close?" Lester asks. 9. "You here until then?" Dennis nods, crosses his arms. Standing this way in his uniform, he looks like something. Lester can't think exactly what. "Tough," Lester says. "I might have to go sit down in back at some point." "Bring a book?" "There's a few back in the office." Lester says his goodbyes and goes. He wonders to himself about the way in which the world scatters people about, even deep in the desert and tundra, where people really have no good reason for being. This idea is mostly prelude to wondering just how Dennis came to be where he is, which is just the flip side to Lester wondering how he wound up where he is. It is almost as if human beings are decorative objects, and the buildings are the ones in charge. That could be a poem, but as he gives more thought to how it would actually go, a very poor one. Back at the house, Lester feels something is actively at work within him, just behind the screen of his awareness. He feels nervous, vaguely sad, tends toward pacing and short visits to the television. After an hour of pointless movement, he sits on the patio and drinks 3 glasses of wine. He flatters himself that he might well harbor alcoholic tendencies, but the diagnosis is weak. As he understands it, alcoholics drink consistently to the point of recklessness, where Lester is minutely careful about almost everything he does. Chances are his drinking habits are merely those of a young person. His field in the light of mid-afternoon looks rather shabby. With the passing weeks, this field has looked many different ways. He would like very much to chalk it up to some trick of the light, and undoubtedly that is some of it. There is none of the beautiful eagerness of early summer left, the days having lengthened into an awful parched dull that haunts the air long past sundown. Correspondingly, things look to Lester's eye overfamiliar, practical, poorly worn. After the wine, he walks around the house some, then goes back out to the patio and drinks more. The bottle, he happily discovers, was left uncorked. The wine makes him sleepy, and he goes inside to take a nap. He wakes around 8 and sits for a while, propped against the headboard, watches the worst thing that he can find on the television, an old game of his. After searching, he finds a cheaply produced program where a scary female televangelist visits Jerusalem and winds up sort of flailing around on a grassy field beside the sea, weeping lots and letting her thoughts flow freely. It is grim spectacle, but, ultimately, less entertaining than Lester expects. He drives back into town, does the loop. The signs all declare bargains of various degrees, and some even display the dollar bill itself, clumsily drawn, immutable. Where is it going, and when will it get there? Nowhere and never, Lester says aloud, a mystery to anyone listening. Dennis is not too disturbed to see Lester back for the second time in one day, and comes along with him, a resigned air. Dennis is in a terrible mood, which he freely admits, explains that a whole chartered busload of retirees landed in the parking lot just an hour and a half before his shift ended. It was only him and a legally retarded man who were manning the shop, so it took an ungodly long time to feed them all. And even then, about a third of them returned because the retarded guy had forgotten to put any toppings on their burgers. It could be sort of a poignantly funny story if told correctly, but this is not the way in which Dennis chooses to tell it, instead attempting to describe the depth of what is actually a perfectly circumstantial injustice. Lester feels for Dennis in an uncomfortable, class-conscious way, but as the story continues, it seems the boy is merely bitching, and also bitching just past the point of Lester's reasonable indulgence. After Dennis stops talking, though, it does not take Lester long to regain sympathy for him in the still and silent air. Dennis smells like sweat and fast food. They pull into the parking lot of the go-kart track on the edge of town. A handful of teenagers linger about at the edges of the asphalt, walking back and forth on the yellow curbstones with exaggerated effort. Dennis coughs. "This okay?" Lester asks. "I guess. It's just that I'm in my uniform. Nobody's here anyway, it's Tuesday. You know, the nowhere day." They walk together to the batting cages, Dennis following close behind Lester. The abrupt cool of the evening has followed a humid day, and there is a light film of moisture over everything, adding the least hint of luxury to their downscale surroundings. The great net that hangs over the cages and catches the balls shines with beads beneath the tall lamps. It is all that Lester had hoped for. Lester almost tells the tale of how often he came here with his father in the more awkward throes of his youth, and how the two of them would spend an hour or more batting, forgetting themselves in the learning and exertion. Lester decides not to tell this story because it might sound like bragging. For all he knows, Dennis is the product of a broken home or something, and in his current state might have an unpleasant reaction to a description of fatherly love. Lester supposes he is being a little ridiculous in this, but by now the spirit has left him, and so there comes another minute of silence to complement the one that came before it. "You want a helmet?" Lester asks, indicating the rack of moist choices in various sizes. "Do I need one?" "Probably not. It's kind of fun, though." There is a slight diversion in the selecting, each of them trying on a few. The pick of the litter is a green plastic job with outward angled edges that make it look like a kraut helmet from one of the world wars. Lester tries it on, and then insists that Dennis take it. "We don't really need helmets," Dennis says. "I don't suppose so." Lester has a huge quantity of quarters, and gives at least half of them to Dennis. They warm up on the softballs, and Dennis seems to be having some fun, launching the fat yellow things up into the net, which makes it rain. He then concentrates his efforts on hitting the hollow pole which holds the net aloft, a target which makes an appealing sound, a loud, meaty clang. Lester suggests they move on to hardballs. Lester gets a couple of good shots off, but Dennis only manages to tip his bat on one, after which he stands there holding his shoulder as 3 more balls zoom by into the back of the chain-link cage. Lester explains that the hardball is the real challenge of the game and becomes easier with some practice. He is disappointed on the next round to see that Dennis has reverted to softballs, which is really a pretty decadent thrill compared to the hardballs. Lester considers pushing the point further, but the success of the whole outing seems tenuous enough as it is. For his part, he manages 5 decent hits out of one set of 10 hardballs, about as good as he can ever remember doing. The balls sink fast and straight into the far fence, a wonderful feeling. His shoulders and lower back ache in a bad way, though, and in a way he knows will only grow worse tomorrow. Lester stops, watches Dennis hit 8 softballs into high, harmless arcs, hitting the pole twice. Dennis digs in his pocket and gives the remaining quarters back to Lester. "Thanks," Dennis says. "By all means. Sure you wouldn't like to give the hardballs another go?" "No, I'm tuckered as it is. I like the easy ones anyway. The easy swing and easy score. It's mechanical." "Like flipping burgers." Lester literally bites his tongue inside of his mouth, to no avail though, as the thing is already said. A mortared stone of the intractable past. Dennis doesn't seem too bothered by it, standing rubbing his shoulders and almost smiling. It seems he has chosen to ignore Lester's strange jab. Perhaps to save things, at least to finish things, Lester pulls from the breast pocket of his t-shirt a small piece of yellow paper folded in half. He holds it forward, offering it to Dennis. "Can you help me with something?" "I'll try. Just read this and tell me if you think it's any good or not." Dennis takes the paper, unfolds it, turns it over and reads. He stands there and looks at it. Takes enough time that he could have read it over at least 10 times. He looks at Lester. "I don't know." "Oh," he reads it again. "Is it a message?" "Of sorts, I suppose." "Is it for me?" "No, I mean, in a way, perhaps. It just is what it is. A poem, I guess, or maybe a part of one. A longer one." "You wrote it?" "Yes." "You write poems?" "Not really." "It's okay. I don't really know about poems." Dennis returns the piece of paper to Lester, and it is time to go. The ride back into town is silent. At one point, Dennis says something that Lester cannot make out, and then he waves away Lester's entreaties to repeat it. Lester looks at Dennis, who is looking out the window with his head leaning against the glass, individual streetlights fading his face in and out of darkness. Lester wonders what Dennis is thinking, if he is thinking anything at all. Dennis leaves the car quickly, but waves a little as Lester drives away. A funny night this, but rich enough for the demands of our young hero. Chapter 16. Such grotesque shapes contentment takes. Lester's larger project in life is as yet a mystery, both to us and to him. So it is with most people. Those two driven too early are objects of natural suspicion, willing to dive into an enterprise whose actual living worth they apparently care nothing about. Those who strike at the sight of red iron receive our adulation and dearest regards, but we miss them as their noble souls dissolve into dense walls of detail, schematic drawings of circuit boards or unreadable academia. The rest of us stand about now and then, rush together, hold hands and have a fair time while singing drunken songs. We do whatever is left to do, hold our secrets close, and at best tell them to 2 others, one of whom will most likely not even be paying attention. We recognize the age in our friends, the frailty, the days showing in their faces, days that must have passed like death. We grow fat in peacetime and thin otherwise. We look at the photographs on the walls of our cozy rooms and cannot quite recall what the issue was. In more earnest times, there was briefly the concept of finding oneself, and beneath this banner, persons of Lester's age and demeanor managed to finagle lots of money from their relatives. It seemed that one did not run upon oneself at the office or the community college, but rather in expensive surroundings of appropriately biblical overtone, the desert or the forest where no people were. These young people were absolutely honest in their pursuit, and so very easy pickings. Their like soon appeared on situation comedies wearing shaved heads and white robes, claiming their tenuous case in front of confused middle-class parents to humorous effect. Almost immediately the 2 words were forced to separate and take up other applications. Handsomely jaded Lester thinks now and again of the possibility that he is engaged on a voyage of personal discovery, though these are of course not the words he would use. Indeed, he would go on to the point where you could not understand what he meant. Nonetheless, Lester seeks a certain possible wholeness in his understanding, and it seems to him at moments like an attainable goal. Eventually, perhaps, he will know enough so the thoughts will all fall into profound categories, and then he will walk about steady, certain, a god of immense quiet smiles. What threatens that bliss is oblivion, the abyss, the spacewalk gone wrong, and the cosmonaut reeling into literally limitless space. The crust of the earth, Lester long ago learned, is to the whole unit merely what the peel is to the apple. Lester has no God, happily enough given his money and sloth. And so these fantastic measurements must somehow fit, rationally, into his schema of the whole. He comforts himself that the answer resides within his subconscious, his partner for the continual tango, the magnificent machine which eats infinity and shits self-esteem. He even imagines the dank unconscious as something he can read by its absence, like the letters on a tombstone. So goes Lester's cosmology, cobbled together from here and there. It is a system shared in part and whole by countless many of his contemporaries. Although a minimal dimple in phraseology, say grace for understanding and soul for unconscious, might be enough to evict him from the atomic age altogether, the system is sturdy enough to allow him to read the papers and maintain an appetite. And in this era, not a whole lot more is required of the citizenry. In addition, he gets to feel he is an enlightened contributor toward the large modern project, and so far as he imagines he is, he can also imagine that there is one. We simplify, of course. Life is not all peaches and Rothkos for Lester. A terror more immediate than interstellar space is things as they are, and, graciously far beyond the perception of most people, the way that they should be. Here we aren't even speaking of torture in humid nations or things like that. We are speaking only of contentment itself and the ease with which most people acquire it. Televised sports, say, the way in which people lean themselves full tilt into their boredom and even, it must be assumed, find actual solace there. How else would they dare glorify the pursuit? Commercials where beer-gut guys dance around in front of the television, holding aloft name-brand snack items. Maybe somewhere there is a better solution, but for now, there is only this, appearing with unexpected frequency in the grind of Lester's thoughts. Some people do not matter. Chapter 17. Direct Apprehension. Pete Convert called up the afternoon after Lester's evening with Dennis at the batting cages. At first, it was difficult to figure Pete's meaning, but as the facts appeared, the point became blunt enough. Tim had stabbed Pete, and now Pete needed a bit of assistance. Sort of stabbed, was how Pete put it. Christ, where? My leg, the upper part. Is it bleeding? It was, maybe a little bit still. I'm sorry, Lester. No problem. Was he throwing it around or something? No, it was in his hand. Lester takes too long deciphering this, looking for any loophole at all. Finding none, he sinks, swirls. He leans against the wall and slides down until he is sitting on the kitchen floor. It is a hack's dramatic gesture, but one conveyed now without forethought. Pete, I'm sorry. Fuck. It's okay, really it is. It's not big. It's huge, Pete. Fuck him. We'll kill him. No, whatever, it's just a thing that happened. Fuck. Pete cools Lester by explaining very precisely what Lester needs to do now. Pete is at the gas station up the highway from the dirt road. He has had to borrow a dime for the first call, a call to Evan who was not home, and then a second to Lester, which required borrowing a whole other dime from a different person. At this point, he's not feeling particularly comfortable here, and people are starting to look at him weird, so if Lester can in fact come, it will be very much appreciated. Of course, Lester answers. Of course. The drive seems all the longer for the frenzy, how within the last hour everything has gone from a C-com to being very complicated. Lester comes under the gloomy certainty that the wound is far worse than Pete has described it, and that he will find his friend, after some unpleasant searching, sprawled off in the weeds, and perhaps he will even take his last breaths cradled in Lester's arms. Such overblown scenes are almost comfortable to Lester's understanding of what awaits him at the gas station, something which will be complicated. Upon arrival, Pete looks to Lester every part the urchin, sitting at the edge of the gravel lot with his legs tucked up to his chest. Just behind him, there is an old barbed wire fence strung between tree trunks, and behind it a cow standing, it would seem, silent watch over the young man. Lester pulls up so that the passenger door is facing Pete, and then leans over to swing it open. A pretty cool move. Pete stands, says, "Have you got a blanket or something?" "What for?" "I don't want to bleed in your car." Lester looks at Pete's leg, clothed in slacks, and the evidence there of injury. There is a slight hole in the cloth over the thigh, and then a stain of dried blood the size and shape, roughly, of a large icicle one might find hanging from the eaves of a house. It looks like quite a lot of blood. But perhaps this is only because it is blood. "Is it still bleeding?" "I don't know. It feels numb." "How do you feel?" "I was feeling a little faint walking here, but okay now." "Long walk?" "Yeah, couple miles." Lester argues that his car's interior is dark and that Pete has probably stopped bleeding anyway. Pete is in no shape to labor the point, and so enters. They pull away crisply, spitting gravel. Pete shivers in the air conditioning. "Is it too cold?" Lester asks. "No, I've just been outside where it's hot." The car is not all that cold at all, and Lester tries to think what exaggerated reactions to temperature are generally a symptom of. Shock, he decides, which might be a sign of dangerous blood loss. Pete is crying. Pete is crying very quietly but heavily, tears moving straight down his face. Lester looks at the yellow line on the road and the broken yellow line beside it, which then turns into a solid yellow line like the other one. Lester puts his right hand on the back of Pete's head. Pete's hair is thick and dry, sunburned like the rest of him. "Okay," Lester says. Pete begins to cry in earnest, and not a pretty crying. His mouth twists up and his hands in his lap assume various shapes of apoplexy. It isn't something Lester's been around for some time, but he feels okay with it, knows at least that something is actually happening. Pete crying like a beat kid is something he can't even think anything else of. It's there beside him, and it might as well be him for how bad it feels. Lester takes his hand off of Pete, and it seems to help. Pete's weeping becomes more quiet and less animated. There is almost the temptation to touch Pete again and see if it makes him cry harder. Pete tries to say something and finally does, says, "I'm sorry." "Please," Lester answers. Pete fixes himself up a bit in the next minute or so, his symptoms changing from those of deep despair to perhaps some sort of bad head cold. He blows his nose on his shirt and leans his head back against the headrest, sits with his eyes closed. "Better?" asks Lester. Pete nods. This is it for the ride home. Pete is perfectly still with his head laid back against the headrest, sitting there far too still to possibly be sleeping, but hopefully resting on some level. Lester takes glances at the wounded leg and feels worried for some time, but the drive is a pretty long one, and this too passes. There's even a creepy moment when Lester forgets that Pete is in the car altogether, and then something alerts him to Pete's presence, which causes Lester a startled spasm. His body gushes with useless energy, which makes all the summer foliage look exaggeratedly bright, and makes driving seem like a far more complicated task than it actually is. When his head settles, he looks over at Pete with the foreknowledge that Pete is there, and finds that Pete is now actually sleeping, slight whistles rising from his mouth and nose. Lester admires Pete's profile as he always has, and now admires the way that it has weathered the elements. The most impressive part is, as ever, Pete's nose, very long but curved enough at the end, so that it is not quite rat-like. The rest of Pete's face might as well be dull, but you could never tell it for the nose. This ride that only just started could go on and on, Lester realizes. The process of helping Pete untangle things as they now stand will be a matter of significant effort and could last for weeks or longer. It is a responsibility and trial Lester does not quite feel up to, that he badly wishes he had seen coming from further off on the horizon. The horror of this event, and two of Pete's remarkably unfortunate circumstances, weigh on Lester terribly. A whole unpleasant world grinding against his own. He fears nothing so much as knowing that at some point he may even have to abandon hope for his friend, give him up to large and unknowable forces. Then, looking at Pete again 5 minutes hence, he feels good enough about things. For some time, Lester has been very much at the periphery of most events, even at the edge of his own life, one might say, though the sentiment is a pretty trite one. Lester lately goes about and only really glimpses himself as that smiling, gamey chap in the mirror perhaps 3 or 4 times a day. Now, by whatever awful means, he is squarely in the picture, and his actions seem to be, for the time being, of some actual consequence. It is not frightening nor entirely unfamiliar territory for him. In fact, as he thinks things out further, very much the opposite. He assumes the part of the wholesome hobbyist, and Pete the airplane, pieces yet to be punched out from their injection-molded sheet, their raw nubs sanded into nothing. The real approaches us from some distance, and then arrives with terrifying speed, faster than anything else we experience. For the most part, life moves through us like a song we've heard before, or worse, a song carefully built to seem familiar. In this way, living is made tolerable even in its crushing size, its obscene accumulation of events, and we are allowed to glide above its blunt monstrosities on wings of boredom. Poets and the like rankle at our blindness, but this is how it has always been, how it should be. We are fragile creatures, and for this reason there is little love of strife within us. So much are we sunk in sweet boredom, that when trouble does come, it is with the suddenness and certainty of the thunderbolt. We know that we are chosen. So Lester now looks over to Pete and sees his chin has lolled against his chest and his whole frame is leaning sideways against the seatbelt. Lester, for his part, even feels lucky that something has happened, and supposes, moreover, that something always happens and maybe he can even be of some use. Can do his very best here. Frankly, it feels like years since he's been this involved. Many years since he's cried himself, or watched someone else cry, and unreservedly given a shit. He doesn't go looking for people to cry at him. This day feels special, though, and as he squints at the picture, the figure at the head of the party resembles himself, if you take away the beard, leading by the forearm the bleeding Christ, and the look on unshaven Lester's face, deep concern, vague disapproval. Behind it is a rambling, sad melody played on a well-tuned piano, exceptionally long silences between the keystrokes. Chapter 18. Largess, not Largeness. Pete is confused about the house, who it belongs to, and why it is that Lester is living there. The ugly photographs of the Dutch village are still up, and the whole place does not seem the product of Lester's sensibilities. Lester explains, and Pete, perhaps understanding and perhaps not, does not ask many questions. It's dark. I keep the blinds closed, Lester says, then lies. To keep it cooler. The wound itself is an unimpressive thing, little more than a vertical line, though when Pete pulls himself up on the countertop in the bathroom and sets his leg down, the cut opens like a mouth, and Lester can see the inside of it. This needs stitches, Lester says. Pete shakes his head at the suggestion and looks away, looks at the wall. There is something almost pretty about the way Pete's thin, blood-crusted leg looks on the perfectly white countertop. Pete is lifting the leg now slightly, which makes the wound close up again. A drop of blood squeezes forth, in the motion like a teardrop. You'll have to get it stitched. It's fine, Pete points. Look, it's fine. It stopped bleeding mostly, sure, but it won't just heal on its own, not where it is. It'll get like lint and shit in it. To staunch the blood and keep the wound closed, they finally settle on wrapping the leg in an ace bandage. Lester first cleans it thoroughly with hydrogen peroxide, a process which Pete shows remarkable restraint in the face of. and proceeds then to the wrapping, which he does very tightly. Looking down finally at his handiwork, Lester feels remarkably capable and smart. Pete seems pleased too, looking at the bandage and swinging his leg back and forth at the knee. Lester gets a towel and some clothes for Pete, so that he might take a shower and perhaps feel generally better about things. Watching Pete hobble back to the bathroom in his tattered long-sleeved t-shirt and boxer shorts, the towel in Lester's clean clothing slung over his right forearm, Lester experiences the tenderest feeling toward Pete's all-consuming shabbiness, a quality which is well past the point of poverty, and into a territory where Lester supposes his distinctions are of little use. There is something holy about Pete that he had glimpses of before, but now is manifest, unblinking. Pete closes the door to the bathroom, and soon the pipes all throughout the house begin singing. Lester orders Chinese for them both from the menu he has hanging on the refrigerator. The restaurant in town is of a rather bland commercial grade, but they do a few things well. He waits until Pete emerges from the bathroom, wet-haired and wearing Lester's clothes. Pete smiles briefly when Lester mentions food, but seems for the most part to have become rather grim again. Really a hard thing to be after having just taken a shower, Lester thinks. Lester shows Pete the liquor cabinet and then leaves to pick up the food. When he returns, Pete is drinking whiskey and watching a nature documentary on the television. Lester puts the little white boxes all across the coffee table and asks if the show is any good. Not really, I've seen it before. It's in Africa, and so you think it's going to be good, but then it's all about bugs. Not even ants or termites, just beetles mostly. No obligation to entertain? The central problem with public television. There's a lot of good stuff on public TV. Some. It's all I can get out at the trailer. Really? One channel? There's the mountain to the north, I think that's the problem. It blocks out the Springfield stations, and the Little Rock ones aren't quite strong enough. You can just barely get 4 on a cloudy day. Pete eats with a plastic fork, and Lester decides to use one too, not wishing on this particular evening to flaunt his skill with chopsticks. They watch cable television, eat the food, and drink whiskey. They do not talk because the food is so warm and good, so very reassuring. Is it okay if I drink a lot? Pete asks. Lester laughs, assures Pete this meets with his full approval. Pete picks up the bottle and takes a wide slug, so that small bubbles rise up to the base of the bottle. Lester has seen people do this before, but it is always a move which seemed affected, an attempt to show how reckless or how desperate they were. Not so with Pete, who executes the motion with practiced assurance, and whose face at the end of it has barely changed. Lester knows that he has a strange expression on his own. Impressive, Lester says, knowing this is the wrong thing to say, but desperate to say anything. Pete shrugs, smiles, reaches for his can of soda. They watch television. Pete thanks Lester for his hospitality, and Lester says that he is pleased for the company. So you just live here? Pete asks. Yup. Air-conditioned, that must be nice. The bills aren't nice, but yes. Do you own this place? I'm renting it, Lester says, then adds for absolutely no reason. Leasing, actually. It's weird you're back here. I didn't expect you'd come back. I wouldn't have believed it either, but you know. Pete nods. Lester doesn't want to talk about himself and his present circumstances with Pete, feels ashamed of the gulf between their situations. I feel guilty about everything, this thought flits through Lester's head. Strange how things work out, though, isn't it? Pete says. His tone and expression are heartfelt, and, lo, it is strange. One way or another, they get to Pete's story. Apparently, things have been ever the worse between Pete and Tim since the party, and Pete willingly, ludicrously, shoulders the greater guilt for things as they are, how he's done too much acid and how that makes him have to ask questions all the time because he starts forgetting things, or things that normally make good sense don't anymore. Tim is a particular stickler about Pete asking questions, or more precisely Pete bugging him, which sometimes Pete does, consciously and subtly, but lately has been doing unintentionally. He's done so much acid in the past month that he has been having these moments where he will just suddenly realize he's somewhere and will not really know how he got there. Frequently this will happen, and Tim will be standing there in front of him, livid because Pete has been repeatedly asking him about something or other that he doesn't want to talk about, and so Pete will be standing there with Tim very angry at him, and Pete will not even be able to remember how it was that he got there, much less what Tim is angry at him for. The issue as of late is one regarding Tim saving up to buy a taser. Taser? Lester asks. Stun gun. Electric, Pete answers. He wants it for parties. To use on people? Yeah, that's how it started out. To cool people out when they got out of hand, which sometimes happens. The idea got mixed up, though, and now he wants to have a party where people come for the taser, like they line up for it. I don't get it. People line up? To get it used, like on them. Oh. That's why I try to bug him about it, because he's saving up a lot of money, like our food money to buy this thing, and he's even saving up for a really good one because they hold more voltage in them and he could use it on more people in a row. But nobody will do that, Lester answered. Nobody wants to get shocked. I think he knows that. I don't think he knew that at first, but I think he's talked to enough people to know that nobody remotely wants to do something like that. But that just makes him want to do it more, because it's so crazy and because it won't work. This was the Tim that Lester knew. There always seemed to be some grudge between Tim and the surrounding world, or perhaps it was more like a breakdown in the most basic lines of communication. It would seem sometimes as though Tim were serving someone invisible, cracking all his jokes with them alone. Lester and Pete, one night after Tim had been particularly awful, had talked out the real possibility of demonic possession and wondered if an exorcism could be arranged by the priest in town. They were fairly serious about it at the time, and even planned the details out, but in the end, it had come to nothing. It was one of those college summers when Lester had been smoking a lot of pot. So it's been real tense, because he's saving this money, and there's not really enough food for both of us. He keeps telling me about how I've been hassling him, and like I said, I really don't remember everything, so probably I've been hassling him a lot more than I realize. So he got really mad, Lester says in a plaintive tone, teasing out the scene. Surely recounting it will be therapeutic for Pete now that he is safe, and also Lester wants to know what happened. You two got in a fight? I don't know. You don't remember? I don't remember. I know what happened, but I can't actually see it happening, the way I usually remember things. I can't remember shit lately. What do you remember? I remember what happened. I know it, but I can't see it is all. Pete's face is thrust forward, squinting as if trying to see. He is even smiling slightly, as if this effort were a pleasant one. I was sitting on the chair in the living room, the blue one. I know it. Tim came up behind me. He sort of knelt behind me so that I knew that he was there, and then he reached around the side and stuck it in my leg. When he pulled his hand back, the handle of the knife was sticking out of my leg. Pete stopped smiling. Apparently explaining what happened was enough that if he couldn't previously see it, he now can. Quickly he adds, but I can't really remember. Lester has the sense of being on very treacherous territory at this point, as if the continued feasibility of Pete's personality were about to be decided. Pete's insistence on the specifics of what he could and could not remember was almost certainly a textbook case of something, and probably something crucial. Lester imagined well-practiced psychology to operate in this way, a navigable system of interlocking realizations. 30 seconds later, though, there was still no breakthrough. and Lester was a little uncomfortable, wanted to see things move. "What do you remember then? When?" "I remember being outside walking down the dirt road. A ways down the dirt road, way past the creek. Real sudden, like I had just arrived there. But when I felt my leg and looked down and saw it, I knew how it had happened. I just didn't remember it happening." Pete gives a look to Lester as if to say, "And that's the way it happened." Lester smiles, supposes that perhaps he is more upset by things at this point than Pete is. His gesture is a good one and elegantly played. He fills each of their glasses 2/3 full with whiskey, and then raises his glass. Pete takes a long time catching on, but then raises his own, somewhat incredulous. "To Pete," Lester says. "To Pete," Pete answers, and then they drink long and with some fervor. It is hard to say just what is good and what is bad, because we see so little of either. Even when the examples are ludicrously clear-cut, the passage of time makes us fools, sewing on loopholes and switching axes. We come generally to regard the good simply as those things which our necessities demand and toward which our inclinations linger. So it must be, just as surely as we mustn't admit it. Our options remain, stale in the air on evenings of insomnia. Surely it is good for us to be so troubled, as surely as we are a troubled soul. It is the stuff of nightmares when one's thoughts travel far out into possibility, where all of our glimmering assumptions stretch into shapelessness, and now and again, in the bubbles and folds, we think we see faces, scary faces. Surely there are happy faces and silly faces too, though we do not usually remember them. Lester, for his part, is happy to be simply directed about, this evening, to have something to do. For once his mind is untroubled with his distance from the present, a distance that is sometimes so great he wonders what entity casts those doubts. More demons, perhaps. Pete, for his part, is now smiling consistently, and Lester is happy, though not much smiling. Chapter 19. Petey loves the ladies. They sit and drink and talk. For the most part, solemn matters are laid aside for the trivial, or at least for matters which are safely settled. We look back and laugh, Lester thinks in a long pause. What very much matters now does not much matter later, and, given enough time, absolutely nothing matters. It is comforting, and it is not comforting. They reminisce. As they do so, Lester begins to feel Pete's junior. Pete, though innocent of many things, seems to have a very firm grasp on his own insignificance, in a way which Lester does not. When he speaks of events, 4 or 5 years in the past, it is with a wistfulness for childhood and its ease. To Lester, this same territory is the recent past, and the issues which it contains are as yet mostly unresolved, contemporary. He feels badly for Pete's apparent maturity and doubts how real it is, attributes it to his friend's recent calamity and habitual drug use. In Pete's shoes, Lester supposes he would probably feel just as down on himself, and even more hopeless. As unsentimental as Pete is about his own prospects, he veers just as far opposite in his depiction of others. In fact, as he unexpectedly begins to speak of the girls whom he has loved, and love is the word he uses, Lester feels uncomfortable at Pete's gushing and wishes he could turn the conversation elsewhere. However, Pete is now drunk and eager to talk about girls, and how pretty even the plain ones can be, and how divine and unreachable their spirits are, and how they are not like men but much better than men, such that men do not in fact deserve them, and the fact that men do actually get them for a while, time and again, is a sort of earthbound miracle. Delineating such matters as human worth along the lines of gender is something which Lester's education has worked very hard to whip out of him. And so he listens to Pete's drunken words, and fits them very neatly into his schema of those clichés which naturally spring up around the friendly relation of the sexes, a matter of which too much has already been said, with doubtless more to come. It pleases him to be able to pin down Pete's words in such a fashion, because they are, in and of themselves, too intimately earnest for Lester to just let pass. Lester is a little jealous of Pete, in that he can say these things so earnestly, that apparently somewhere within his experience, Pete's thoughts and the time-honored thoughts of that larger mind have for some span intertwined, become identical. It is jealousy, which Lester feels, and it is something else also. The trick of it is that in high school, Pete received most of his girls second-hand through Lester. The minutiae of this are too messy and long gone to describe, but a fair summation is as follows. Various girls would approach Lester. There would be a time where Lester would be apparently going out with them, and then within a couple of months, Lester and the given girl would not be interested in talking to each other anymore. Soon after which Lester would hear from one source or another that the girl was now seeing Pete. This may seem a natural enough process, except that it happened exactly so on 3 different occasions. Neither of them ever really discussed the matter with the other, but neither were they really upset by it. Pete was happy with the girls, and Lester did not miss them. Now they are both drunk, and Lester accuses Pete of having stolen all his girlfriends. His tone is angry enough, but he's never actually been upset that this is how it was. Lester is drunk, though, and wants to take the wind out of Pete's sails. Pete looks pretty serious on this subject. "You weren't going out with them anymore," he answers. "Maybe I was and maybe I wasn't. Appearances can be deceiving." "They said you weren't." "You asked them?" Lester asks, and then some venom. "You asked all of them?" "I think so." "But you never asked me." "I didn't?" "I guess I didn't." "You didn't." We include this exchange with some trepidation, fearing it might improperly set the tenor of the evening in the reader's mind. All was very well between Pete and Lester, in fact better than it had been for many intervening years. Each held up the other to examination against the homunculus which had grown, unchecked, within the tide pools of their separate minds. There were countless things here to analyze and calculate, whole vast schema to retain and to discard. We offer the conversation, problematical as it is, to the conveyance of the evening as a whole, because it says much that is important and otherwise unsaid about the childhood friendship between Lester and Pete Convert. Chapter 20, De Perfunctus, in which we find some endings that in and of themselves may not be entirely satisfying, but at least one hopes satisfactory. If even that fails, then one can only await other pleasures some distance down the pike, or even suppose that whatever has been laid down this far will, in the soil of time and the sunshine of contemplation, take eventual root and sprout forth with blooms unimagined. With such diversionary foils as these, dissatisfaction might be gracefully sidestepped until it finds some target more worthy than our strangely stilted, yet largely heartfelt tale. Satisfaction is a tricky business, of course. Its hard-won acquisition the stuff of legend and song. In its absence we feel the vague itch, the encroachment of detail, the bottomless terror of reincarnation and infinite regress. Boredom, some argue, is actually a recent phenomenon, less a matter of having nothing to do than having the sense that one is doing less with what one has than the others are. They say mammon breeds dissatisfaction, so that those human beings ensnared within it willingly go about the tedious business of its chronicle. The satisfied, though, are famously hard to budge, can burn off the hours in stupid inactivity without blinking for even a single second into the density of doubt. Still other simple souls wake one morning to discover themselves both 45, and rich. Lester, for his part, feels actual revulsion at satisfaction, and we have done our best to discover why. Perhaps some real passion lurks somewhere inside of him, Faustian striving and all of that, a sort of wrinkle in the substance of continuous survival. An unrelenting boredom is symptomatic of giant and incurable things, but it is mostly his alone. On this evening at least we allow him some satisfaction, a narrow and very dense band of it, between the time where he puts Pete to bed for the evening and then finally finds sleep himself. He has surrendered up his own bed to Pete, and Pete for his part does not protest this, as he has not really protested anything since his real drunkenness began an hour or so before. Intervening there was some cable television and a moment where Lester was drunk and very amused about something. Pete couldn't tell what, so that Lester was jumping up and down on the couch and laughing, screaming at the television. It was funny to watch Lester, and Pete laughed even as he was trying to make him sit back down, just chill out. Pete then, falling asleep in Lester's big bed with his limbs stretched wide like a man upon the rack. The bed is over twice as wide as the one upon which Pete usually sleeps, and its surface is deliciously regular in its firmness. Pete feels lifted as if by a tractor beam, gently turning, watches the regular blink of the tiny red light on the ceiling. Lester on the sofa in the living room is as happy as we will see him. What makes him happy just now is love, he realizes. A love not profound, nor even noteworthy, but a simple sort of love, the gentle, wet love of grandmothers. Maybe he even prayed for this day, or a day something like it, a day in which he could be of use and do good things. If so, this is not a prayer he can remember making. As sleep comes, the love looms larger, fearsome even. Love is responsibility too, and responsibility is limitless, and leads in a more or less straight line to the grave. He imagines himself bailing Pete out of jail when both of them are middle-aged, perhaps even comforting Pete when the wife of his second marriage leaves with the child of his first. This thought started out gloomy, but these scenarios are in their way oddly pleasant to Lester, as is the thought that he will grow old and countless many things will happen to him. Which is really as happy as most of us ever get. When even the thought of growing old is congenial, then we are very far gone. Lester wants to remain awake and savor this, but already he is falling, fraying at his seams. The room moves. In his vision, the digital clock on the VCR reads 2:18 and clicks ever slightly to the left. End. Part 1.